Here's another really important one. I think there was some doubt last time. They're clearly asymptomatically infected people who
Mm.
are transmitting virus. And that's a big deal because you don't know who around you is shedding virus. They're not sneezing or coughing. So those are some of the things we've learned just in 2 weeks. It's really remarkable.
Talk to me. So hello, everybody. I'm Ethan Evans. I'll be your host today. I am vice president of Twitch Prime at Amazon. However, I'm not speaking here on behalf of Amazon or Twitch. I was just lucky enough to get introduced through a member of my community to our guest today, Dr. Vincent Racaniello, who is a professor of immunology and microbiology at Columbia University in New York City. And brave man that he is, designated an essential person. What is it? An
Yeah, I'm
essential.
essential. First time in my life, I'm essential.
So as an essential person, he is resident. He's actually in his office at Columbia right now. And he's coming back after 2 weeks, and he's going to talk to us about the evolution of the coronavirus pandemic. And so with that, I have a list of questions. My co-host, Evan Nash, has let me know he'll be here in just a couple minutes. So we may have to pause when he shows up. But with the audience here, I would start with, yes, and so people are observing again the macrophage pillow you have. They love that. That's like the
Yeah.
best thing. That's the best thing in your office for
Yeah,
sure.
I made sure it was visible. So there we have the pillow. Then next to it is polio. You maybe can't see it, but then the big picture on the wall is Ebola virus too.
All right.
And my office is full of these little 3D models of viruses and so forth. Yeah, I really like them.
Yeah. Well, do you want to say a little bit about what you do, your regular life outside of now being a guest on CNN, on many radio programs and media? Talk a little bit about your history.
So I'm trained as a virologist. I got a PhD many years ago working on influenza virus right here in New York City. I then did some post PhD training on polio virus, and I came here into Columbia in 1982. I'm at the medical school. I started a lab, which still goes, and we do research on viruses. Currently, we're doing very little polio, but another virus which everyone's going to hear about this fall, enterovirus D68. You'll see there'll be an outbreak of that. We work on that one. And along with that, I teach virology to undergraduates here. I do a bunch of podcasts. This Week in Virology is one of them, but many others. I put my videos of my lectures up on YouTube. I write a blog every week. What else do I do? I read a textbook of virology too. And I love talking to people about viruses. I really enjoy, in particular during this outbreak, I've had a lot of contact with people. We're getting over 100 emails a day to TWIV, just asking questions and thanking us for being available. So I've kind of morphed beyond a researcher. Most scientists don't do this outreach, but I think it's important. And, the current outbreak shows why it is.
Yeah, you're the Isaac Asimov of our times, really, and certainly um, you're a case study. As my followers know, I normally teach career. Right, I'm on Twitch sharing my career expertise. I would say you are a case in point where preparation has met opportunity because you already had a podcast. You were comfortable when I was connected to you. You already had a great microphone. You were set up to stream. And so it's been very easy to bring you here onto Twitch to share with the big Twitch audience about coronavirus.
I have to tell you that I've been podcasting for 12 years, been teaching, right? Also, that helps in front of 150 students every lecture and all kinds of other speaking. So I'm totally comfortable doing this. It really prepared me for CNN, right? Where you're there with two people and millions of people are watching. And I was nervous because I didn't want to mess up. But, afterwards I thought I did well because I've got all this experience at speaking quickly, answering questions quickly, listening and being able to quickly come up with something. So yeah, this is kind of a training that most scientists don't get, but it's come in really handy. And since we've been doing this virology podcast 12 years, I mean, we're here and we have a little voice of expertise because we're not some new podcast that just popped up, right? Which a lot of things are going that way, but we've been around a long time.
All right. Um, well, let's hit the first question then. So the thing I'd most love to know is, in the last 2 weeks since you were here, what are the things we can definitively say we've learned about COVID-19? And I realize these things may not be kind of meet the full standard of scientific proof, but what would you say to a reasonable lay level of certainty we've learned?
That's a good point because, in science, we take a long time to disseminate information because we rely on the publication model where you write a paper, you submit it, it takes weeks and weeks and weeks. So in 2 weeks, a lot of papers have been written for sure. And they're mostly on these preprint servers like bioRxiv and medRxiv. You can actually go and look at them before they get published. So there's a ton there, but a lot of that we're not sure is going to pan out because it's going to be peer reviewed and maybe someone will think there's something wrong with this. But I would say one of the main things we found out is that this virus is quite capable of spreading in pretty much every country in the world. The ages that we saw it targeting in China are pretty much the same elsewhere. We have really good numbers from some countries. And we know a little bit more about its stability on surfaces. I don't remember if we talked about that last time. We might have, but now the paper on that has come out. We understand that both respiratory and surface transmission is an issue with this. We know that, here's another really important one. I think there was some doubt last time. They're clearly asymptomatically infected people who are transmitting virus. And that's a big deal because you don't know who around you is shedding virus. They're not sneezing or coughing. So those are some of the things we've learned just in 2 weeks. It's really remarkable.
Yeah. So Devin has arrived. I'm sure you may see him on your screen,
I do.
Vincent.
Hey, Alex, how you doing?
You're out there in the galaxy.
Yeah. I've you had to get away from the virus, so I decided to go to space.
It's a good idea.
It was pretty elementary actually. I just took one of Elon's rockets, and now I'm out here. Yeah.
Good to see you again.
It's good to see you too, and thank you so much for coming back and doing this. I can't tell you how much impact our original talk had. I mean, literally thousands of people.
That's great.
Yeah, were impacted by it, and I think that will also be the case this time. As I know, Ethan and I have done a lot of preparation to ask you some new questions about, particularly about the current societal impact of this and everything.
Can I tell you both one thing?
Sure.
Very quickly. So after I did the last Twitch, I was asked to go and do a Google thing with some Google employees, right? Quite a few people. That was cool because they wanted to learn all about viruses in general. And guess who was watching? Sergey Brin.
Wow.
Can you imagine? A student. He was a student of mine for a short time. Anyway.
Oh, wow.
Really? That's actually insane. Oh, my God.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's actually crazy. Wow. Oh, my God.
Well, congratulations. It's like we talked about. Your reach has the reach for your virology blog will never be the same now. So
that's sad. I think people will leave after the outbreak is over, but I'm hoping some will stay for the next one. There's going to be a next one. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, you already mentioned a next one, some virus you're working on that was a bunch of letters, and you said it will break out this fall. I think you terrified chat. I don't think we're quite ready for number 2. If we can wait just a little bit.
I'm ready. Hit me. I think one of the most inspiring things about researchers and people like you, Doctor, is that you can bridge a gap of understanding in things like virology, where people are so usually so removed from it, and in doing so, you influence a new generation of people to research these things.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important. I hope to inspire some people to be virologists. If I do that, that's the best thing I can possibly do.
Yeah, it's critical. I agree.
So, Devin, you switched camera views. There we go. Now,
I
now
got
you're
it, dude. I'm on, dude.
all
I
right.
got it. I know. I am the OBS champion, dude.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, my chat was yelling at you to get big. So
Wait,
now
why do
you're
they
big.
care?
They-
Because they see that input. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Got it.
So they saw
Yeah.
little you. So Vincent and I had just started talking about what's been learned in the last couple of weeks, and I
Cool.
wanted to ask a few follow-ups on that. Do we know if reinfection is possible? There's been the rumors circulating about, people get well, then get sick. Do we have anything more definitive of if you are so lucky as to survive, which is most people, can you get sick again, at least right away?
Yeah, this has been a persistent issue over many weeks now. So typically we think you get infection with a virus, you deal with it in a couple of weeks, it's over, and then you're immune, and you typically don't get infected again unless it's an influenza virus, which manages to change from year to year. But most other viruses don't do that. And there's been some reports that people were discharged from hospitals in China. And the criteria for discharge is you would have 2 consecutive negative diagnostic tests where they would do a nasopharyngeal swab and they look for viral genetic material. And you have 2 consecutive swabs negative. And then resolution or improvement of your symptoms, respiratory symptoms. And then they would do x-rays and see the lung lesions getting better. And if all that happens, then they send you home. And then there were some reports of a number of individuals who started shedding virus again. And they followed up with some patients and did diagnostic tests. Now, as far as I can tell, they didn't get terribly sick again. They just seem to be shedding virus. So what's going on? And I think we can't say definitively because none of this has been published. These are all anecdotal reports. A few have been published, but not really very many. So one possibility, of course, is that one of the 2 diagnostic tests was a failure. It was a false negative, right?
Right.
And so you would get 2 in a row that seemed to be negative. You released the patient, maybe you really only had 1. That's possible, I think. The other possibility is we're just learning now that more and more individuals get a gastrointestinal infection with this virus, in addition to the lung infection. And it could be, and I think I've seen some data which suggests that you can shed virus in feces longer than from nasopharyngeal specimens. So maybe these individuals were actually still shedding virus. They were actually still infected in the intestinal tract. But a lot of people are afraid because they're saying, oh my gosh, that means you can never be immune to this virus. Well, I don't think that's true. It's too early to say that. But I think that even if some people are reinfected, they're not going to have serious disease on that second infection. I think it will probably be much milder because they'll have some kind of antibody response. So in general, as I said, viruses give you some kind of immunity, but there are some viruses where the immunity doesn't last forever, yet it's still high enough so that if you get infected, you get a very mild disease or one that you can't even tell. So I'm not too worried about this reinfection. I would assume now, if you're reinfected, it's going to be a rare event and you'll have mild disease.
Okay. So I'll go one more, Devin, and then you can jump in.
I have a trillion questions.
I'm sure. So we'll just take turns here.
Yeah, okay. That's good.
So surface transmission, and particularly things like packages in stores or that are delivered. One of my viewers reported that some kids thought it was funny. They were going through a store where she saw them and they were coughing on the bread. Whether or not they were actually sick, just to freak people out.
These are people that we should actually, like, the Spartans should have thrown off the cliff, by the way.
Yeah.
That's these are. Sorry, we're on a professional show. I forgot.
No. We are on a professional show, Devin, but I'm with you on that. That kind of behavior needs, that's a place for the people who see them to step up and drag them home by their ears to their mothers. But in any case, Vincent, what do we know? How worried do I need to be if a package comes to my door or if I pick up a can of beans in the store, that I'm going to infect myself off of that because it was handled by an infected person?
So this is all about risk, right? And assigning levels of risk to different kinds of activities. And if you do that, I think you can manage this reasonably well. I think last time we talked about a study that looked at the stability of virus on different surfaces, including cardboard, which would be a package, or plastic and so forth. And the bottom line was that the virus infectivity will last a number of hours depending on the material. Cardboard, the half-life is about 8.5 hours. That means after 8.5 hours, half of the infectivity is gone. And the real key here is how much infectivity do you need to pick up from a piece of cardboard to infect yourself? We don't even know that. So we're kind of working in the dark here. But
And that's what I was hoping for your intuition on. Is I get the virus survives there, but how much of sort of a risk? That's more of an academic result, and so please go on about the risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk from a package is quite low. I mean, the scenario would be that whoever's handling the package, say the person who delivers it is sick, they're shedding virus, and they're touching their nose and getting mucus on their fingers. So your package has potentially virus on it. And if you touch that same place and then touch yourself, you could get infected. So, and we have no reports yet of this happening. If this were a widespread thing, there'd be cases where they would interview the people and say, "Hey, I got this package the day before I got sick," and we don't have any of that yet. So I think the risk is probably minimal so far, but it's potentially there. So I would be careful when I get a package. I let it sit inside the house for 24 hours. We'll have this urge to open it right away and see what we got from Amazon or something, right? But let it sit there. Or if you want to open it, just wipe it down with a bleach wipe on the outside, just to be safe. I tell people, look, if you consider everything a potential vector for infection, you'll be better off, right? So it's my mic here. I don't know who's been in here before me. So if I'm touching it, I have to make sure I don't touch myself until I wash my hands. The doorknobs, when I give a credit card to the gas station, just consider anything with a public face potentially contaminated, and be careful about transferring that to yourself. Mm-hmm. So I think the risks, though, of these activities are low. I think it's more likely that you will get it from being close to an infected person who is shedding it or shaking hands with an infected person. But we do know that in certain situations, you can get it from inanimate objects. So I say you have to be careful. Now, the good news is that the virus will not last forever on any of these surfaces. It won't last a week. Most likely, it will last at the most a few days.
Okay. Thank you so much. Devin, what would you like to ask?
Most of my questions are oriented towards like sort of macro ideas and things. I wanted to make sure like there are things that we didn't cover on the last episode, and also take into respect the massive change in the worldwide ecosystem that we've had since that time, right? So I think one of the major questions I have is, do you believe that the societal response to COVID-19 is in line with what we should be doing? And do you think that correlates to a reduction in the virus being spread? Is what we're doing making sense? Do we need to do more? Do we need to do less? What's?
Yeah.
And I have the same question, which I figured. So have at it, please.
So we have some instruction, right? We have first China, which, learned of the infection at the end of last year, and then in January instituted draconian measures to limit people movement, basically. Mm-hmm. And they did that for a sustained amount of time, and they apparently have got the infection under control in about 2 months, I would say.
Yeah.
So it's possible to do this if you make people stay at home and restrict their movements and their interactions and so forth. Now in Italy, now they are the second highest number of cases behind China. They had an early series of infections, failed to limit any population movement until it was too late. That had already spread, and as a consequence, they have a lot of infection. So now, in the past week or so, they have, shut down movement of people. And if you look at the case curve, it seems to be going down in Italy. Mm-hmm. So even though they instituted those measures late, it seems to have made a difference. Now, here in the U.S., we are very early on, because really it's only been a week or so that most places have started to limit movement. There are some exceptions, but here in New York, for sure, last week, people were moving around freely. and our numbers are still rising. And so, but if we take the lessons of China and Italy was less draconian than China, I would say. I think they can make an impact. I don't think you need to close down entire streets. Like here in New York, people are talking about shutting down streets to cars and foot traffic, which I think is totally not needed, because as it is, it's very deserted here. And you need to go outside, right? At some point, if you keep people inside for weeks and weeks, you're going to have a worse problem than coronavirus, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to balance it. Obviously, you always have to have a balance between what you're doing and how people are reacting. So I think just telling people, look, stay home from work for a period of time. Don't go to restaurants. If you go outside, stay away from people. Be careful what you're touching and so forth, which is what we're doing now in New York. My feeling is that will work and that will be sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And wherever the virus is going throughout the country, if you look at the map of the cases, there are dots everywhere over most of the U.S., although there are places where there's nothing yet. But wherever you see outbreaks, that you should do that. You should restrict people's movements. And I think that will help. And it's not going to last forever, as we have seen in China and in Italy.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
I guess we're trading. Yeah.
No. It's totally fine.
Yeah.
You go.
Do you feel like the I already forgot the question because Ethan, go ahead.
I'm so sorry.
Can I just make a comment? Let me make a comment.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the whole issue here, what we're trying to do
Mm-hmm.
is not overburden the hospitals, right?
Yeah.
Because,
that was my question.
So we know that 80% of the infections are mild. Only 20% are serious, and some of those require hospitalization. And many of those people will recover if they're properly cared for in a hospital. There's no reason for most people to die of this infection. Absolutely not. If we can take care of you, you'll be okay. But we only have a finite hospital capacity. Here at Columbia, we have already over 600 people with just SARS-CoV-2 infection.
That's nuts.
They're going through 50,000 face masks alone each day.
Holy shit.
They're going to run out, right? And then the hospital staff is in trouble because they can't protect themselves. What are you going to do? We don't have enough face masks in the country. So that's why we want to lower the burden. It's not so much that we're worried that everyone is going to die. No, absolutely not. We're just worried that a fraction of the population is going to have to occupy beds in hospitals, mostly older people, but there's a scattering of younger people in there, but mainly over 60. And if they can't be taken care of, then many of them will die. And that's the problem.
The follow-up question real quick was, do you feel that by limiting all of this, people will just pop out after the quarantine is over and then we'll just have this problem again? Is that possible?
So far in China, they're starting to move around again.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, they've had a few cases which have been imported from other parts of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now other countries have got the virus and they're bringing it back. It's gotten a full circle. So I think you have to be vigilant. Yes, you have to do it gradually. I don't think you can release everyone at once. That doesn't sound good, release everyone, but you know what I mean?
But it's true. A lot of people feel quite, just ask my kids. They see it that way. Please go on.
Yeah. No, I think you need to do a graded release and you have to really monitor very carefully what's going on. I think part of the problem, at least in the US as I see it, is no one's articulated a plan. They're saying now you have to stay home and restrict your movement, but no one is telling us how long this is going to be. What are the stages leading to, reversal of this? I think it would be nice for the population to hear that, right? I think that would be comforting in a way to say, well, we're going to look every week at the numbers, and if we see this, then we're going to consider changing. And I think that hasn't been done, and it would be very helpful. But I think we can avoid probably having the situation where the quarantine is over and we get all reinfected. There are a lot of infections going on right now. And most of them, I have to say, you see the numbers reported. I think there are 10 times more infections because we can't test everybody. We're doing still very little testing. And that's immunizing the general population, which is good. The more immune people, the harder it'd be for the virus to spread afterwards.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things that I've been told is that we talk about the R naught of a virus, basically how infectious it is. For every person, how many more will become infected. One of the theories I've heard put forth is that the people who are highly social roles, let's say business travelers or flight attendants, they're going to tend to be more likely to be exposed early. And so the result is, if there are subsequent waves of the virus, say coming back in the fall, which I'd love to talk about if you think that's likely, that the most likely super spreaders will have already had it, and so it will tend to decrease the spread rate in the future because the people who are in those super public roles will have been first to be infected and therefore first to have recovered and be immune. I don't know if that has any basis in science, though.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the people in very public positions are mostly getting infected for sure. A lot of healthcare workers here are getting infected because they are seeing so many patients a day. It's hard, even when you're very careful with personal protective equipment and so forth. It's very hard not to get infected. So as long as they're going to have to be, if they're tested, they're going to have to be withdrawn from the workforce. So that's a problem.
Yes.
It's a temporary problem because then after they recover, they can go work and they'll be immune to reinfection. And this brings up another issue, which is, the tests we're using now, the diagnostic tests can tell you if you're infected, but they can't tell you if you were previously infected and now are no longer infected, right? Because the nucleic acid is gone. However, we can use an antibody test to ask, have you been infected at some time in the past, and therefore you're immune? And those tests are now just coming out. And some of them are going to be kinds of tests where you can take a little bit of blood from your fingertip and put it in a dipstick type apparatus. And in 15 minutes, you're going to get a result. Do you have antibodies to the virus or not? And that's going to help identify people who are protected and can go into these very public roles. So I think the answer is that, yes, those kinds of people are likely already infected, and many of them probably without even knowing it, because they tend to be younger people. And that is a good thing, as I said, because it's going to contribute to the herd immunity that we talked about last time. And it will, so a virus goes into a population of, 100 people. If 70% of them are immune, it's going to have a hard time transmitting to those others who are not immune, right? So that's one of the benefits of those sorts of individuals being infected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a silver lining to a dark cloud. I'll just share, and I'll hand back to Devin. My extended family has a couple of people who work in emergency room settings, and they're letting me know that they're already in the Seattle area out of personal protective gear. And they've been given relatively, sort of comical advice. One of them works in an urgent care center, and he was told, well, if your patient is coughing, interact with them from 6 feet away. And, as a physician, this seems like, wishful thinking from an administrator. So I do think you're going to see a lot of those problems.
Well, I think that this is a key problem, the personal protective equipment. Because think of this, when any patient in a hospital who has an infectious disease, you have to wear PPE when you go in the room.
Right.
And typically someone goes in the room every hour to do something. They put on new PPE. When they come out, they throw it away.
Right.
So, you could do that once an hour, 24 hours a day, and you can see how the numbers multiply. And we should have had a stock of all this way back in January, before January, as a pandemic preparedness, but we didn't. So maybe we'll learn a lesson, and next time we'll have stockpiles. What's going on now, I understand, is that certain labs are trying to see if the PPE could be sterilized and reused, because most of it is disposable and it's rather flimsy and doesn't stand up well to high heat and pressure and so forth. But people are experimenting. Can we autoclave these things and reuse them X number of times? And that would really help.
Yeah, I guess from what you said, while you would need some system to manage it, since the virus doesn't live on surfaces for very long, the real way to recycle it would be to store it for 3 days or whatever.
You could do that. You could store it under high heat conditions, for example, not so hot as to melt it, but hot enough to inactivate the virus quicker. And that's the kind of study I'm sure they're doing. Let's put virus on this face mask and we'll heat it at this temperature for X hours. Does that get rid of infectivity? Those are relatively straightforward experiments. And then they could say, okay, all the hospitals, put your face masks under these conditions and then you can reuse them. That would really be great.
Yeah. So, and my chat has a bunch of medical professionals in it right now talking about the circumstances in each of their workplaces. And I'll just summarize for you and say none of them is excellent. They're all pretty bad.
Yeah.
Devin.
One of the most important things I think we could talk about, and then we didn't cover it all the last time, was what is really the true time frame of a vaccine, in the sense that Seattle has just, the Seattle Kaiser Institute has actually just put something in a human, right? Which is seems unbelievably quick. My understanding of this sort of process is this is ultimately a race against either time or herd immunity, and especially if we're going to get like another wave of this next year. So what is like the true time frame of a vaccine? How does that work? Like, how is it that we're already in human trials? Like, what's the framework of this?
So the vaccine that's being tested in Seattle is it's remarkably fast, and if that all works out, it could be in people on a big scale in 18 months, which would be a record for a vaccine. And so to make a vaccine, you have to decide what kind of vaccine you want to make. There are all different kinds now that we can make, from the whole virus, just inactivating it with chemicals, to taking parts of it and using other viruses as vectors. You have to test it. First, you test it in cells in the laboratory and make sure that it works. And then you put it in experimental animals. You inject it into your animal, a mouse or whatever other model you have, and then you show that the vaccine gives immunity like it is supposed to in people. And that can take months. And then when all that is good, you go to the FDA and you file an application to do human clinical trials. And they look at your data. It's all called preclinical data because it's before people. And then you get a permit for a phase 1, which is being done in Seattle now. Now, this particular vaccine that's being tested, that is basically a nucleic acid vaccine. It's an mRNA vaccine. If I could bring you back to biology, you have DNA in the nucleus of your cells. It's transcribed to make mRNA, which goes out into the cytoplasm, and then that's translated into protein. Well, some time ago, this company took mRNA for a viral protein, and they found they could coat it with lipid nanoparticles, small particles made up of lipids, and inject it into an animal. It would get into cells, and the cells would make the viral protein, and the animals would make an immune response. And so they knew from previous experience that this concept worked. So as soon as the SARS-CoV-2 virus was isolated, the genome sequence was published, this company took the sequence of what is called the spike glycoprotein. If you remember, the virus particle has a membrane with spikes in its proteins by which it attaches to cells, and that's called the spike protein. They took the mRNA for that. They put it in animals. They showed that antibodies are produced. And based on that, we don't know exactly what they did because it's all secret, but they said they have some efficacy data in mice. The NIH and FDA said you can do a phase 1. So now that mRNA has been produced, it's been injected into 45 people. And the goal of that trial will be to first say it's safe, to make sure that none of those people have adverse effects. And second, to see if they make antibodies against the protein. And that should take by the end of April. If that's all good, then they do a phase 2, which means let's see if it actually prevents infection in people. And by the end of April, we should still have enough ongoing infections that it could be tested somewhere in the US. So then they'll take a bigger group of people. They'll give them a couple of different doses. They'll take a group that they vaccinate and another group that has a control. They will get an injection of PBS, saline, and then they will send them out into the world. And then, at intervals, they'll bring them in, see if they've been infected. They will do a diagnostic test for infection. And then after a period of time, which could be 9 months, they will look at the data and say, oh, everybody got infected at the same rate. Vaccine didn't work, or the vaccinated people were protected. And so that would mean that the vaccine worked. And at that point, that's a phase 2 trial. Typically, you would go on to an even bigger phase 3, but in this case, they might expedite it and do a really big phase 3, which involves a lot of people in at-risk places. And this would bring us into 2021. So that's why it takes so long, because you have to do these phase testings, because you want to make sure it's safe and it works. Because if it's not safe and it doesn't work, you can't give it to people. Because if you did, you could never convince people to take another SARS-CoV-2 vaccine for years, maybe, if you had a bad outcome. So this is, as vaccines go, this is really fast. And that's just one. There are many, many others being done by other companies. So we're going to have a whole bunch out there, so we don't rely just on one. So I think, 2021 sometime, we're going to see if this works. Now, by then, this outbreak will be over. But I think in the future, there will be another one of this same virus, and it can be used for that.
Can you talk just a little bit more on that? What do you, realizing that you don't have a crystal ball, and if you did, you would move a few blocks over to Wall Street and be quite wealthy. Do you have any idea or reasonable anticipation about a future outbreak? A lot of people say summer might give us respite, and then it will return with cold weather in the fall.
Actually, if I had a crystal ball, I would still do virology, because it's the coolest thing you can do.
Good answer.
The heck with Wall Street. So I'm assuming that as the warm months come here in the U.S. and the humidity rises, the circulation will drop. It will become less efficient, and that's because the heat will help to inactivate the virus, and the humidity will, those droplets that you exhale, which are full of virus, they will, as soon as they come out, they will absorb moisture and they'll fall to the ground even quicker. So that we know heat and humidity does reduce transmission. And together with the growing population immunity, I hope that will stop transmission by June or July. And we know that for some virus infections, that's what happens. For influenza, for common cold viruses, they peak in the winter months, then they stop in the spring. As two things happen, the population immunity is higher and the temperature and humidity rise. So we don't know if that's going to happen with this one. We do know that there are other coronaviruses out there that cause seasonal colds that go away after the winter.
That are seasonal. Okay.
They're seasonal. And so we're hoping this is going to do the same thing. So my guess would be, and others have suggested this as well, that sometime by maybe June, transmission is stopped in the U.S. However, there will probably be somewhere in the world people who are still infected with this virus. And so then in the fall, winter, as the temperatures drop and the humidity drop, I'm sure we'll have another outbreak. And I don't know when it would begin. It could begin November, December, kind of like when the flu season starts, and proceed through the winter until the next spring. And I have a feeling this virus will be with us forever. It'll go through these cycles of seasonal infections. We'll have a good population immunity so that most people will not get severe disease. And then there will be a vaccine available that will protect everyone else. That's my thinking about what's going to happen.
So long term, that's a pretty happy story. Long term.
Yeah, long term, this will become. So I spoke with an expert coronavirologist last week, and he thinks this will become another one of those seasonal coronaviruses that just cause mild infections. In fact, he thinks they all started many hundreds of years ago as epidemic
as
viruses like this one that caused global outbreaks. Of course, then we didn't notice it. We had no medicine. We had no communication. We had no idea. Now we do. And then over time, population immunity built up, and now they're just common cold viruses. And this is probably going to be the same thing at some point. So yes, it's good in the long term in that sense.
Okay. Well, that's excellent to hear. So Devin, I don't know if I took us away from your question on vaccine before you got everything you wanted. I guess Vincent, there'll be.
I have other questions related to it.
Yeah, so you can follow up. Yeah, well, there'll be tons of pressure from governments to rush the testing process. In other
Mhm.
words, I won't name leaders, but I think some leaders will say, well, it seems like it might work. Just jump over all of that and save our economy or something else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Do you have any opinion on what rushing is possible? Like, is it possible to rush something into production in the fall by taking more risk, or is that just not possible, period?
I think you can. I wouldn't call it rushing because that implies you're cutting corners, right?
That
I
was
think
what
you,
I was implying. So
I
maybe you
think
have
you,
a better way to do it.
no, I think let's call it accelerated development. It
Okay.
sounds in a business world, right? That's a good word. Now, let me give you an example. Back in the 80s, when AIDS appeared out of nowhere, right? When we finally got the virus isolated and made diagnostic tests so we could see who was infected, then the next thing is we needed antiviral drugs. And some candidates arose very early on, like AZT.
I
And
remember AZT.
the FTA wanted to do its usual long trials, but there was a very active patient community of many, many thousands, tens of thousands of individuals who said we need this drug. And so they fast tracked it. In fact, many of the initial HIV AIDS drugs were fast tracked by the FDA. They said, okay, we'll accelerate the clinical trials as fast as we can, but still being safe. And so now we have a slew of HIV-1 drugs, and they have some side effects, but for the most part, they've been shown to be safe and effective, and they're great at controlling the disease. So I think you can accelerate development. The 18-month timeline for this vaccine is accelerated, and I'm sure that if we have infections in the fall, they can do a phase 2 trial. They can do a very large phase 2 trial that would encompass a lot of people. And that's, of course, what they have done in Africa with Ebola outbreaks. They have basically used massive distribution of the vaccine as part of a trial. So they're protecting people as well as getting the data. So you can certainly do that. There, the only issue arises: who's going to be the control group, right? If you have a so with the Ebola vaccine, this is a really interesting story. They had some early data suggesting that it was effective at preventing vaccines, so they wanted to do a bigger trial, and they could not ethically give a control group. They didn't want to give people in that outbreak the placebo. So what they did instead was to give a group of individuals the vaccine, and then the control group was delayed 2 weeks after the exposure, so they could see how that compared. Eventually, they got a vaccine as well, so people would not die, but they would get infection, and that worked beautifully. So you have to have those kind of ethical considerations in hand when you're going to use a vaccine testing in an outbreak situation.
Well, there's tons of ethicist questions here. Maybe we'll get to those in a bit. Follow up on the vaccine part, Devin.
In terms of these treatments that can possibly come out and before the vaccine, in terms of just to clarify real quick, like as a yes or no, you said that 18 months is an accelerated time frame for a vaccine.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, all right. So in terms of these antiviral therapies, we're saying there's some word around chloroquine. Some people are saying that can apparently help treat it. Is there any substance to the idea that antivirals may be a stopgap measure in the meantime while we wait for a vaccine? Is there any sort of information along those lines? And is there any evidence right now that the antivirals that are being pitched by sometimes large government leaders, right, have any efficacy? Yeah.
So let's tackle chloroquine. So
Yeah.
as you know, chloroquine is used to treat malaria, and there's a derivative called hydroxychloroquine, which is used for other things like rheumatoid arthritis.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an FDA approved drugs for those conditions. And a study out of China and one out of France recently suggested that it might be useful in treating patients. The study out of France came out last week, and they only treated 22 patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say the results are suggestive, but should not be interpreted to mean that we should use it. I think we need a bigger clinical trial than was used there. They only looked at viral load. They didn't look at clinical outcomes, and I think that's crucial. And they didn't look at dose. So My understanding is that clinical trials of hydroxychloroquine are being planned here in the U.S., so they're going to happen very soon. And we'll see from those if this is worth using. And if it works, that's great because this is a widely available drug, and that could make an impact on the outbreak. But I would caution people not to, if you have hydroxychloroquine, don't just keep taking it for thinking that it's going to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection. The drug does have side effects. It can be toxic. There are already reports out of China that people are dying of toxicity of the drug. So don't do that. Wait until we get the results. So that could make a difference, but we're not ready for it yet. Contrary to what certain leaders have said, the scientists behind the leader said we're not ready to use hydroxychloroquine yet. There are a couple of other antivirals being tested in a number of places globally that have previously looked good for other coronaviruses. One of them is called remdesivir, which is made by Gilead, a company that makes a lot of HIV drugs. And that, I think those results will be out very soon. So that could make an impact as well. So I think the antiviral picture is a little rosier because there are already drugs out there that have been used and tested, some of them even FDA approved, like hydroxychloroquine. And if they turn out to be effective in patients, then they could be used way before a vaccine. So that's good news, I think. And we should know those results, within weeks or months.
To be really clear on that, no one in the population should self-medicate with antiviral drugs at this stage.
No one should self-medicate. No. If you're sick, you should see a doctor for sure.
Okay.
Because the downsides are that you could die. And I know some people have taken what they thought was chloroquine, but was really a fish tank cleaner, and they died. So you shouldn't self-medicate.
Oh, God.
Yeah, super important.
So if we can go on the lighter side for a minute, is it not true that a relative or a related drug to chloroquine was originally quinine and used for malaria?
That's
and
right.
That is also what's known as tonic in gin and tonic. Is that was the original tonic? Is that?
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So the good news for chat is gin and tonic is at least related to a potential coronavirus medication. So with that lighthearted reason,
you can certainly drink gin and tonics. There's no problem there.
All right. Good to know. Devin, back to you on vaccine, or you hit another thing I wanted to talk about, which is not surprising, which is the potential treatment drugs.
Yeah, or I mean, just staying on that theme of potential treatments in general, there are so many people that are coming. I always remember there was this book. Sorry. There was this book.
You know better than to cough on this stream, right? Like everyone. I touched my eyes and got a ton of flack for it. Go ahead. Sorry.
Your mistake is your reading chat. Okay, so I was reading this book a long time ago. It's like a book about the the theoretical zombie invasion. It's by Max Brooks, and in the book, what they do is they issue this drug that supposedly is going to cure it, right? And I'm seeing all of these shopping networks that are saying that there's a cure to COVID-19. It's some silver solution type of thing, and there's all of this stuff. I just want to be really clear with you that right now at this stage there isn't anything on the market or in general in science. Do we understand anything to have actual real antiviral, all this stuff like curcumin and turmeric and any herbal stuff? Is there any legitimacy in any of that stuff at all?
I mean, I don't know of anything that is known to inhibit this virus in people. There's nothing that we know of aside from the trials that are ongoing. And I know people have been, people are get scared. So they say, does zinc work? Does vitamin C work?
Yeah.
But there's nothing, there's no information. The virus is a few months old in humanity, right? So we don't have any information except anecdotal information. People say, oh, I took zinc for 3 months and I didn't get sick. That doesn't mean anything. it means nothing to the general population because you need to do a controlled investigation of anything that you think might be useful. And so people are just risking hurting themselves if they take too much of anything and think that it's going to prevent infection, because there's no evidence that anything works at this point. As I said, there's some things in the pipeline and they may turn out to work and they'll be useful. But I would say just protect yourself. Don't take anything that you think might be good just because someone told you. It's not the right source of information.
Do you have any any confidence whatsoever in any kind of herbal remedies or anything like that?
As I said, I don't see any evidence that they do anything. Right. So if someone tells, I get emails all the time, people saying I took this herb and I'm fine, but I don't know what that means. So no, I don't have any confidence in that.
Roger that.
Oh no, now it's all three of us. So I'll change our topic just slightly to something I'm sure is of interest as well. Can we talk a little bit about why testing has proven so difficult to scale? Because it seems like South Korea, for example, has used very aggressive testing as a way to locate those asymptomatic cases and manage their outbreak. But we seem, as a country, at least speaking for the U.S. here, we seem almost, if it wasn't tragic, it would be comically inept.
So South Korea did the right thing. Back in January, they said, looks like this virus is going to be a problem. It's spreading in China. So let's assume it's going to spread elsewhere. And they're close by, of course. So they started looking for a diagnostic test, and they happened to pick one and test it, and it worked early on. And so they ramped up production of that and tested a lot of people. And that was key in knowing where the pockets of infection were and who to quarantine, right? In the U.S., the CDC took charge early on. They said, we're going to be the only ones that can do these tests, and we're going to develop it. And they tried, and the first version they made was flawed. It didn't work, which they had sent out. And so that wasted time. And then they had to remake it. But still, they said, you have to send the test to us to do. And in retrospect, of course, that's completely flawed. Here in the U.S., we have amazing tech, right? We have all these cool companies that can do all sorts of things. Why not leverage them? Source the development of the test all over the place. Let other labs do the test. Well, finally, CDC realized that they should let local labs do testing. So in many states, various companies and hospitals took up the testing on their own development of the test, and now they're all doing it. Here at Columbia Hospital, they have their own test in the hospital that they can run instead of depending on an outside lab. So the answer is the CDC, in my view, the CDC mismanaged it. And they could have said at the beginning, hey, 20 companies who are interested, or whoever's interested, develop a test. Here are the reagents you need to validate it. And you can bet that that would get done really quickly. You'd have more than one candidate, and they'd have it back in January. And that really hamstrung us, because now to this day, we really don't know how many people are infected, because even today, with the test situation solved, we don't have enough to go around, and there are pockets of people infected all over the place that we don't know about. So that's my view of what happened. All right. So hopefully, again, we learn a lesson, and next time when there's an outbreak and we need a test, the CDC says to companies, make a test and let's see which one is good, and we'll use that, or we'll use multiple ones. You would think in this country we could do that, right?
You would think that, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it was UW, right, that deliberately defied the CDC order to originally produce 1,000 tests a day, and as a result of that, they found the first case of transmission in Seattle, right? So
what happened with UW is they were doing a flu study.
Oh, okay.
And they had specimens, which then they tested for the virus. You're right. So it's not like they were diagnosing infection in individual people. They had all these samples in the lab, and they said, let's run a COVID-2 test on them. They could do that. That's not doing diagnosis, right? Yeah. And they said, oh my gosh, look, we have a lot of infected people here. And of course, if we had done that in January all over the country, we'd be in better shape. Yeah. So thank you, UW. Yeah. Yeah. The Seattle Flu Project.
Yeah, both Devin and I, for the audience that may not know, both Devin and I live in greater Seattle area. And so we were in the original epicenter. And an honorific, which I think has been transferred to where Dr. Racaniello is now in New York City. But yeah, UW, I admire that. I think there's a place. They weren't hurting anyone, and they were saving people, or at least giving the information that can save people. So there's a time for understanding where you can be creative in interpreting guidance.
No, that's why I think the CDC should have opened it up from the beginning. There's so many creative people in this country, right? Great companies, great universities that can do all sorts of things. Why not take advantage of it? Why, make just the CDC do it? Makes no sense at all. But hopefully, as I said, I hope next time it's different.
And what kind of, how much testing capacity do we need? Like, in other words, given that we have a generalized outbreak, that would be, I don't know better words for it, but a lot of it and a lot of unknown. How do you deploy? Let's assume magically there were more tests. How many do you need, and how do you use them? Like, what's the right use in your opinion?
Well, there are two ways you could go about doing that. So you could say we're going to test everyone, which is really difficult, especially in a place like New York City, or we're going to design a study to sample different areas, which statistically will give us an overview of how much infection there is, right? We're going to look in different neighborhoods, different demographics, and all of that stuff. And that makes more sense. And so you don't need here in New York, you don't need 10 or 11 million tests, which would just making them is hard. But let's say we could make them. Running the tests is going to be hard for any laboratories. So I don't think you need to test everyone, but you need to get a sampling of the neighborhood. So I would say you need hundreds of thousands of tests. And this is not what we have at the moment. We have tens of thousands. This hospital does, I think, 500 tests a day, which is really nothing. So that's my opinion. We should have ramped up the testing back in January and done extensive testing throughout cities and suburbs to get a sense of who's infected. That's why the Seattle study was great, because they had just collected 1,000 samples randomly for a flu test. And from that, you could see how many people were infected. That's the sort of thing that you have to do. And so it's not everyone, which is good because that's logistically very difficult.
Yeah, we can't make 330 million tests, probably.
Can't.
And that's the U.S. Globally, 7 billion. We can't test 7+ billion people.
No, and of course, some tests don't work. You have to do it again, so the number is even higher.
Yeah.
But you want a sampling. You want enough of a sampling, and that's what statisticians are paid to do. They design the sampling so that we say, where do we go in New York to sample to get an idea of what's going on in the whole city? You don't have to sample everyone. When I was on CNN, the news person, she thought everyone would have to be tested. So maybe not everyone knows that. You don't have to test everyone, but just a sampling in different areas to get a sense of who's positive. And that would say, well, there's this neighborhood in Brooklyn. There are a lot of positive people, and maybe we should look at more closely and tell people to stay home from work. That sort of action.
Okay. So, Devin, I covered testing. What else would you like to?
I thought we're on you, right?
Whatever. You go.
I wasn't prepared.
You weren't prepared. All right. That's okay. Vincent's wonderfully patient. For those, I'll cover for you for a second while you come up with a question. I'll just, the audience, a lot of you have probably joined in the last hour. We're live with Dr. Vincent Racaniello, who is a professor of immunology and microbiology at Columbia University Medical Center in New York City. He also goes by Earth's virus professor. So he's been podcasting for 12 years. And earlier, when we discussed his having a crystal ball, he said he would still study viruses and not move down the street to Wall Street to make a killing. So he's very passionate about this topic, and we appreciate him being here.
So one question I think that I'm getting a lot in chat, but also was in the notes was, are you seeing any abnormal risk factors show up with this virus? So in particular, I think the two that are of immediate concern are, one, it appears to be in more males than females, and two, there seems to be some very rough anecdotal association with smoking, vaping, e-cigarettes, things like that. Can you commentate on these things?
Yeah, so there was in China a strong bias.
Obesity also, yeah.
Obesity is another one. Yeah,
Mhm,
there's a
mhm.
strong bias in China for males, and I actually have in front of me a document from Italy. Just they have a daily summary of surveillance, and the it's 58%. So this is just total infections: 58% male, 42% female. So that seems to be a trend overall for this virus. And why that is, well, we don't know the answer, but we do for other virus infections. We see sex determining susceptibility to infection. Sometimes females are more susceptible, sometimes male. We think it's in part governed by hormonal differences that influence immune responses in some way. But there are most likely other things as well, and we don't have a really good handle on it. That's one kind of I guess for most people it's unusual, but for me, having worked in virology for a while, we're used to these kinds of sex differences controlling susceptibility, and people are very interested in understanding how they work. Now, of course, if you have a variety of diseases, I think hypertension, heart disease, and diabetes are three of the top ones that will predispose you to getting more serious infection. Um, and remember, when you get a serious infection with this virus, your lungs are basically filling with fluid. So it's very hard to breathe. And that's why you need to get oxygen. And depending on how serious it is, you may need to have different forms of oxygen, different ways the oxygen is provided to you. So, if you have heart disease, that's going to do it. If asthma has not risen to the top of risk factors, but for any respiratory disease, asthma will make it worse. We know that even for a common cold, in an asthmatic, a common cold can be more serious. And then, of course, there's obesity, which is um, interesting. I haven't seen good numbers yet, but I've heard anecdotes about that, and I don't know what the mechanism would be, why it would be such. I don't think the virus is particularly multiplying in adipose tissues, but something else must be going on, and that'll be interesting to follow. And hopefully, I can come back sometime in the future, and we'll have some more data, and we can talk about that. But those are some of the predisposing factors, some of which we understand, some of which we don't. And then, of course, there are people who get sick, and they seem to be perfectly healthy at different ages as well. And many people have asked me about that. What's going on there? And I would say, these people are healthy. They exercise. Their weight is great. They don't have any known diseases. And that's the key. Known. They must have something. They must have a mutation in some gene somewhere that is predisposing them to serious disease. And, someday at birth, everyone's genome is going to be sequenced, and we'll be able to look and say, oh, you have this mutation which predisposes you to serious coronavirus disease. So make sure you get a vaccine. That's the kind of thing we'll be able to do once we sort out. And now from this outbreak, we can take people who have had serious disease and mild disease. We can just take a little bit of their blood and sequence their whole genome from it and compare them and say, what is it? And we'll have thousands and thousands of samples. It's a great sample size to do this and say, what kinds of mutations predispose you to serious disease? That'll be cool information when it comes out.
So we could eventually have like a 23andMe study where it's like, oh, you could get coronavirus, get a vaccine. Yeah.
Potentially, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's super cool.
That's amazing. And when what can you say a little bit? You talked about how men are more susceptible. I know a lot of people would love to know, why are the mortality rates or apparent mortality rates in different countries so different? So, for example, Italy looks very bad. Not that far away, Germany looks not as bad. What can you help the audience understand about why there's such a difference between countries?
So first, before I do that, a little caution on these mortality rates or ratios, actually, that are being thrown around. In a way, they're not useful, because the way they're supposed to be calculated is you have the total number of deaths divided by the total number of cases, right? And the bottom number is key. And those now in this particular infection, we're diagnosing infections, but we're not catching everyone. That denominator, I would say, is at least tenfold underestimated, right? So if you have a country with a 10% case fatality ratio, if the denominator is actually 10 times higher, it's only 1%, right? So we don't know the number of infections because most countries are not screening everyone. Now, in Korea, where they did more screening, the case fatality ratio is less than 1%. Here in New York City, it's less than 1% because I think we have a lot of hospital capacity to take care of people. So that number is misleading, and I think we're not going to have the real number until way after the outbreak is over. And then I suspect that these numbers will go way down. I think they're all inflated because we don't know actually how many infections there are. You know, if you're going to calculate deaths over cases, you need to know that denominator, and we simply don't know that. So, you know, the press throws around these numbers and scares people, but I would say don't believe it. I don't think that's a solid number at all. And the other aspect of that, of course, is the number of areas according to how old you are. So I'm looking at the Italian numbers right now, case fatality ratio. If you're 0 to 9 years old, it's 0. Nobody has died in Italy. In fact, no one has died up to 29 years of age in Italy as of today. And it's only 30 to 39. It's 0.3%. You know, it's a little low until 50 to 59. Then it's 1.5%. 60 to 69 is 5%. And then 70 and up, it gets high, 15%. But I would argue still, that's probably an inflation because we don't know actually how many people are infected. So maybe if you just remember one thing, don't pay any attention to the case fatality ratios. I don't think they're properly calculated. And it really depends on how old you are and whether you can get medical care. You know, in Italy, the system is close to being overwhelmed and they can't take care of people. I think a lot of the, you know, Italy population is very old compared to many other countries. And so they have a lot of infections in older people just because there are more of them around. And there, you have to care for them. A lot of those end up in hospital, and they are having a lot of trouble taking care of them. So that's, you know, that's not a factor that's inherent to the virus. I always tell people that this case fatality ratio in many ways is not a virus property, right? Because you can influence it by the kind of medical care that you give someone. It's not an intrinsic property of the virus, as say transmissibility is. Yeah.
The only way it would be an intrinsic property is if all the people had the same care or something. And anyway, I totally see your point. What else, Devin?
That one was my question, right?
I don't know. You just go.
I'm not.
All right.
I'm actually. The problem is I'm counting and you're not.
All right. I'm sorry.
So I have a question like prepped that I don't. Okay.
I'm so sorry. Well, I have plenty. I have plenty. Okay. So
you go. It's good.
Vincent, I saw something. When you were last here, you said that if someone sneezes or coughs, the aerosol virus, and I will try to count better, Devin, or chat will keep me on point.
That's good. We're good. I'm just not prepared.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
I'm also taking really comprehensive notes so that we can have like a public repository of all the information because they helped a lot last time.
Yeah,
that's
totally.
Another reason why I'm like also like engaged.
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
That's fantastic that you're doing that. So a report you said that the droplets that could be infectious, the large droplets, you believe probably fell from the air pretty quickly because they're heavy and large. But I've definitely now seen a scary report coming out again saying, oh, you know, infection can go for up to 3 hours after someone sneezes or coughs. And that seemed to make social distancing kind of weird because if I have to go to the grocery store and I stay away from people, but someone sneezed half an hour ago, am I really still vulnerable? We talked early in the show about, I guess, relative risk, but do we know anything new about that, or is that just conflated information about aerosol transmission?
So those kinds of extrapolations are hard to make because the best ones are made in a family setting where one person comes and they're infected and they're all in the same home and they have to stay home and then the others slowly get infected. and you can get a sense for how that infection was transmitted. So it's not really hard science, but that's the best you could do, because we can't infect people and say make different droplets and so forth. But here's what we know. We know that those large droplets carry the virus that you produce by coughing, sneezing, and even talking can produce those. They're relatively large, about 5 microns. You know, they would be trapped in a face mask, and they fall to the ground within a couple of feet. You know, as in everything else in biology, nothing is black and white, nothing is digital, right? There's always fuzzy edges. So 6 feet is, you know, could be 5, it could be 7. It depends on the air currents also. You know, if there's no air, it's going to fall to the ground. If there's some air, it may remain suspended longer. And I suspect that's why some people say, oh, it could go farther. But eventually they will very rapidly fall to the ground. If you're in an area where the air is still, I would say within minutes they're on the ground. And there they have much less risk of infecting you. So if a person has walked through an area and you go a half hour later, you're not going to get infected with their aerosol. I think you have a greater risk of touching something that they've touched. That's why you have to be careful in public places. All right. So but that's not to say that there aren't exceptions. And we heard of a case from our coronavirus expert last week where apparently there was a super spreader. So, you know, the average person infected with SARS-CoV-2 infects 2 or 3 people. Super spreaders, there's an example from China where one person infected 15 people. So that's a super spreader. They're pretty rare, and we don't understand what's going on. But they said for this person, that person walked through an emergency room. That person was only there for 15 seconds, and 15 people got infected.
That's insane.
So it must be it must be that person makes a lot of virus, and maybe in some of the smaller because you're making so much, that virus makes its way into the smaller droplets that can spread farther in a room, you know. So as I said, you know, we think the virus is mainly in the big droplets that fall to the ground quickly. But you can imagine if your respiratory cells are making more virus, maybe it could get into the tiniest droplets that can go further in a few people, in a few rare people. So I think, again, that's an exception you shouldn't worry about. Most of the time, these droplets fall quickly. And that's why we say, you know, the most risk is in a room with a lot of people. If there are lots of people close around you, and the more people, the higher the risk, because then you have a greater chance of one of those people being infected. That's why here in New York, we're telling people, you know, stay away from people on the sidewalk, and you're reducing your risk of inhaling something that they're exhaling.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm sure it's your turn, Devin.
Now I wasn't counting him, to be honest. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, in terms of like, I've had a lot of questions about viral load, and this might be like pretty technical, but there's a certain amount of virus that needs to be transmitted. You've mentioned several times that just because you touch a surface with a virus on it and then touch your face, my guess is this is going to be highly dependent on people's immune systems and things like that. But like, is there any idea that of like infection as it relates to like a person could touch the virus and touch their face and then not get sick, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
If there's not enough virus, I mean, we know that you need a certain number of viruses to infect you, okay? And it's usually a lot. It's usually thousands. You know, a droplet can have many, many viruses, and how many are in a droplet depends on how good your cells are at making viruses. And so the super spreader may make many more viruses per droplet, say, and that's why they spread more effectively. We don't actually know what you need. I would assume you need thousands at least, maybe more. And so, you know, what's on a box or a surface may not be enough.
So another follow-up question to this that a lot of people are asking is it possible to get a lower dose of the virus or the infection? For example, could you get, so let's say that you touch a surface and you get infected at some lower rate, let's say, and then you get less sick. Are these possibilities, or do you, if is there some peak of infection? Like, how does, basically I'm asking how this mechanism works.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. Yeah. So I think if you have a low dose, let's say you need 10,000 viruses to start a rip roaring infection, right? If you
Mhm.
get infected with 1,000, you know, the whole process is slower, right? To get to the same endpoint, you're going to take longer. And in that time, your immune system is going to be able to control the infection. So when you get a lower dose, there's less chance of overwhelming your immune defenses. And so you may have a asymptomatic infection or a shorter, mild infection. So yes,
So initial dosage does matter.
dosage absolutely matters.
Hmm.
The problem is, as I said, it's hard to study this because we can't infect volunteers. It's not ethical with most viruses. There are some viruses where we can do this and we have a good idea. So, for example, we can infect volunteers with norovirus
Hmm.
because they just get diarrhea for a weekend and apparently it's okay.
It's acceptable. Yeah. Yeah.
So we know that very few particles, 10 or fewer of norovirus, is enough to start an infection. But norovirus is unique in that sense. Most viruses, you need much more. So, yes, dose matters. And so, what's on a package may not be enough to start as good an infection as a droplet or several droplets that you inhale from an infected person.
Very so important follow up is would the inverse also be true, where people who are exposed to a very large amount of the virus initially are they more at risk to develop severe symptoms? So, for example, healthcare workers or people that are around multiple infected people.
I think the severe is not necessarily true, but let's do a scenario, right? So remember that you're inhaling droplets.
Hmm.
They're going into your nasopharynx or oropharynx, and if you just inhale a few droplets, a few cells get infected, and it takes a long time for the infection to get going. And as I said, the immune response can't control it. Let's say you now inhale a huge, you've just walked through a cloud that someone made by sneezing by accident. You've inhaled many, many, many droplets. So you're getting multiple infections started in your respiratory
Hmm.
epithelium. So you can imagine that that's going to overwhelm you more quickly. It's going to overwhelm your immune defenses. So the infection will be will proceed more quickly. It'll be more extensive and maybe more severe. We don't have a good connection. I know a lot of people are thinking about whether, say, a healthcare worker that's in contact with patients all the time, would they necessarily have more severe disease? I don't know about severity, but I would say that the more inoculum you get, the more likely it is for you to get infected and develop a full blown respiratory tract infection.
Okay. Would it also be possible on the lines of like those healthcare workers that are in contact with patients? Would they have would is it typical that they have some kind of maybe enhanced immune response because they've been exposed to so many viruses in the past? Preschool teachers, things like that. I know there's a big concern in the United States right now where people could where the healthcare system could get overwhelmed, right? Is there
Mm-hmm.
is there any chance that that could be a competing factor? Is there anything, or maybe what does that situation kind of look like? And what is your opinion on like the likelihood of that like overwhelm happening or progressing? And I guess that question kind of transformed, but it got better as it went along. So yeah, yeah.
Well, from what I can see here, uh, many healthcare workers are getting infected,
Hmm.
right? Because there's just so many. We have over 600 COVID-19 patients here. And so the likelihood that you're going to be infected is high. And many of the staff are infected. They have to stay home, obviously. So it gets harder and harder to provide appropriate care. And, in an ICU, you sometimes need one person per bed. So that's a real problem.
Hmm.
Um, I think that the amount of virus they get can make a difference, can accelerate the infection and overwhelm them more than it would someone else getting an infection a lower dose by another route. But as for the idea that they get multiple infections throughout their lives, does that boost their immune system? Um, I don't think in general we have evidence for that. We know that some people will still have bad responses to particular infections, even though they've been infected multiple times throughout their lives. So I don't think that's really a factor in a healthcare situation. I know many healthcare workers get serious infections nonetheless. So the only good part is that if you've gotten infected, you're immune to it. But you get something else, I think it can be just as bad.
Um, the, in terms of the healthcare system, do you foresee a reality with the current stats that you're looking at, that like New York right now, there's a high chance of overwhelm in some of these places in the U.S. Could this happen?
No, I don't think so. I think I have a
Okay.
lot of faith in the healthcare system in this country. I think if they're going to run out of PPE, they're going to figure something out by then. Um, I think they'll rally around whatever happens and take care of business. I think we have a big capacity, which is good. I think having a lot of people staying home is going to help a lot over the next week or two.
Mhm.
So I don't see it as an issue. It's scary, I know, but I do think that the system is flexible enough to be able to handle it.
Would a major policy change, such as like the federal government suddenly opening up the quarantines, like for example, I know the president mentioned that he wanted to open things up by Easter, ideally. Would a major policy change the direction of that, or do you think the current system that we have is adequate to? Uh,
Well, I don't think that anyone should make predictions about when people can go back to their lives because we don't know the course of the epidemic yet, right?
mhm.
It's still ongoing in this country, and no one knows where it's going to go. So I think making such statements isn't particularly helpful. What I can say is that eventually we will be able to leave our homes and do whatever it is that we want to do. It's not going to be forever. It may be a month, and maybe 2 months. Um,
How do we know? How do we have any idea of like what time frames we can return? Is that some kind of stats that some people are working out? Like who makes those decisions and stuff? Like what
well,
like yeah.
so nobody makes the decisions, but what you do is you look at the data as they emerge, right? You
Mhm.
go on a week to week basis and say, what's the course of the infection in different parts of the US? Do we see some peaking in certain areas? Is it still going up? If it's still going up, we have to maintain the quarantine, I'll call it, let's say. But we know from China and Italy, and I would argue that we can use those as examples of two different kinds of containment, China more so than Italy more like what we're doing, that the outbreak peaks and then is over. And in Italy, in really just about a month, they had extensive infection. And now it seems at the latest numbers, that seems to be going down for the last few days. So I think that's all good news. But the thing is, I don't think it's right for people to say it's going to be over by Easter. It may be over sooner, maybe over later. I don't think it helps people to say that. And I particularly think that the scientists, the health officials in this country should be giving us that information because it just gives people a false sense of happiness that, oh, by Easter I'll be able to do this, but maybe
Mhm.
not. Maybe it's the next week. So I have complete confidence that this will be over. We'll get through it, and we'll have good immunity and so forth. So I would tell people, don't be scared, don't panic. It's just something new that's got to run through the population. And we'll, as we have said earlier, eventually it'll become a mild infection that no one even thinks about.
That's a great answer. Yeah. Thank you for, by the way, for doing that. Because there are so many other people, even doctors, that are, I think, one of the things that really interested me. I don't want to call out the show specifically, especially in like a professional context, but there was another doctor who came on a very prominent show recently and had like a very like using a lot of the same data that you have, like took this sort of doomsday, we're completely unprepared, like it's going to overwhelm us, millions will die, type of thing. It's
Oh
so
yeah,
yeah.
there are all kinds of views out there, right?
Hmm.
There are people like that, which I think are uncalled for.
Hmm.
I mean, countries have gotten through it. I don't see why you have to have the doom and gloom view. And then there are other people who say we're doing too much or we shouldn't be doing this, which I think isn't really fair for older people who are most at risk for dying, right? And so there has to be some, I'm in between. I think this is completely manageable. I have faith in the infrastructure of this country. I do think we should have started earlier, but this is where we are now and we'll get through it. I have no doom and gloom, and I don't think we're doing too much. I think we're doing just about the right thing.
Well, that was actually going to be my
Ethan,
next.
how you doing?
Yeah, I'm back. Should be more in range at the moment.
He fixed
Wait.
his mic so it's now silent, right?
Uh,
Actually, I think he might.
can you hear me?
Frozen.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
I thought I was like he had a concerned look for a while, and then I actually
Uh,
realized his webcam was frozen.
yeah.
Yeah.
Something in the house froze.
Okay.
So I think we're good.
By
Anyway,
the way, you notice here, the sun is
sunlight.
beginning to come down in the sky. It's 4:30 here, and the sun. I have two wonderful windows here. You can see it's now
Yeah.
shining on me. The sun is just come below the roof line, so it's in the window. It's kind of nice. It feels good.
Uh, all right. My question on that would be, you've said we're doing just about the right amount. So, though it's not your area of expertise, there's obviously a lot of concern about economic impact. You brought up the issue of what's fair or unfair. Fair is a loaded word.
One second.
How we think about the older people who are more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say, to the limit of your expertise, which I realize we had an economist on our show between when you were here and when you've returned, can you say a little bit about that balance between economic impact of all the stay-home orders and managing the epidemic? Because as a leader, I feel like I've been dealt a very poor hand of cards here. I can choose between death or economic ruin. Those being extreme, but I love guidance, and I'm sure the audience would as well.
Well, I am certainly concerned about that aspect also, and I think we can't do this forever, obviously, because that would be really economically disastrous. And as you say, I'm not an economist, but I do have a concern that we look at the data clearly and closely on a weekly basis, and we reverse this as soon as we can. And I do think there's a balance of interests in this country. We have a number of healthcare officials like Anthony Fauci, who is concerned about the health of the nation. And then we have other individuals who are concerned about the health of the economy. And as you said, you have to balance this. I totally agree with that. I don't think we need to shut down for months and months at a time. And we shouldn't do that because the consequences are even worse than the infection. I think we're going to learn a lot from this about what measures work to restrict the new virus infection. We can use this next time, and hopefully we can test earlier so we don't have to go this draconian route. But I do think for at least some weeks, it has to be done. And I understand that businesses are going to suffer. And that's why, you hear that the federal government is going to step in and help those. They really should. They should help from the bottom up, not from the top down. From the bottom up, small businesses need a lot of help. I think that should be provided. And I agree. I think we should move out as quickly as we can, but safely. And that's why I said before, saying Easter as a deadline doesn't make any sense to me because we don't know where we're going to be at Easter. But I would, and I would maybe, if I were in charge and giving a message every day, I would say, look, here's our plan. We're going to look at the numbers every week, multiple times a week. And here's the curve that we'll get to. And if it's here, this is what we're going to do. But we're not hearing that. And I think that would help a lot. But there's certainly going to be damage to the economy. Things are going to go out of business. I understand that. That is the decision that we have made. I think it's the right one. I think it's the humanitarian decision. But just like I said before, we'll recover. There's nothing we can't recover from. We have a resilient system here that works. So I believe this is the right course for what we have to do to prevent people from dying.
All right, thank you.
We see there seem to be these like sort of petri dishes in different places in Asia and where animals and human and also in America and when animals and humans are living in close proximity and can lead to these new strains of viruses happening. You had mentioned, I think one of the most fascinating things in our first show that you had mentioned is that your personal belief is that viruses tend to evolve more towards transmissibility than lethality, which is fascinating, I think. But do you think that there is anything we can do as a society or that we can become more conscious of to kind of like stem the possibility of a more transmissible and possibly more lethal virus coming up in the future? Do you see that as an inevitability?
Yeah, because we have such a huge population now and we have contact with animals everywhere. It's really hard to avoid, and they're always going to be with us. And, we talk about the bats which are all over the world and from which viruses come in Africa, for example, not just China. But here in the US, viruses come out of rodents and infect us. It's not just confined to certain parts of the world. It happens in Malaysia, it happens in Australia. So this is a fact of life that we're always going to be getting viruses from animals. In fact, every human virus that we have now came from an animal at some time or other in our history. That's where we get them from. We don't make our own viruses. So we need to somehow be ready because we can't stop it. You're not going to stop population growth. You're not going to stop population mobility. You're not going to stop encroachment of people into places where there are bats and so forth, right? It's always going to happen. And so we have to be ready in two ways. First, we need to know what's in the bats and other animals out there. We don't have a good sense.
What do you mean?
Well, we need to go out and sample these animals and see what kind of viruses are circulating. After SARS-1, there were a number of efforts to do that. People went into caves in China and sampled bat guano, which is on the bottom of the cave, and bring it back to the lab and see what viruses are in it. We need to do more of that. We only know that SARS-like viruses are in bats. We haven't looked at any other animals, just pangolins recently because they were for a short time suspected to be involved, but they're not. So we need to have more sampling of animals to see what viruses are out there and might pose a threat to us. And what did I mean by pose a threat? Well, after the first SARS, people were collecting these SARS-like viruses in bats and asking, can they infect human cells in culture? Do they have just that simple capacity? Because if they don't, then they're less of a threat than if they do. Because if they can infect human cells, that means they could start the way to adapting to good transmission in human, which, by the way, is not an active process. It's not that it's a goal. It just happens. A random virus arises that can transmit, and that is sustained from people to people. So we need to know these simple things. What is out there? Which of them are a threat because of their ability to infect human cells? And there is remarkably little information on that. We don't put very little money. There's just a handful of nonprofits that support this kind of research. We used to have a government program called Predict that was looking for such viruses in animals, and that was canceled by the current administration, which is a real unfortunate situation because that was one way that we were answering this question: what is out there and what's a threat? So I'm hoping this incident will empower scientists to go out and say, look what happened. We can prevent this next time. And I totally think we could have nipped this in the beginning in China if we had been ready. I totally believe that.
Huh. That's interesting.
We could have had antivirals that would nip any of these bat SARS-like coronaviruses. We could have had them, but there wasn't sufficient interest at a number. Scientists are certainly interested, but at other levels, there wasn't enough interest to have them. I'm hoping after this incident, scientists will be empowered to step forward and say, look, this is what we need to do. Give us the money to do it, and we'll be ready next time. There's no reason that this virus should have moved out of China. We could have taken care of it for sure. So the answer is we need to know what's in animals because they're going to be the source of future viruses. If we do nothing, there'll be more pandemics. Someone asked me the other day, will there be a COVID-20 disease?
Yeah.
I said, probably not 20 because we're in 2020, but there could be a 21 or 22. Who knows how many years it will be? It's a rather rare event, but it's so catastrophic that we don't want it to happen. So it's preventable. We just need to.
The cost is already in the trillions.
Yeah,
it's unfathomable. Yeah, easily.
I mean, just the stimulus packages in any one of several countries are in the trillions. So it's trivially tens of trillions, and it's not too hard to figure out that the cost of insuring against that, like the medical research bill for what you're talking about, is probably only in the hundreds of millions. I'm making this up, but the support for what you're talking about is not a big number compared to what we've just spent. It's a very small number.
And that's a good point because, really, while we don't want anyone to die, and in the end, the total deaths will probably not compare to the economic cost of the outbreak. So if you are a numbers person, we should prevent these from happening just to prevent that from happening in the future. I would say we also want to save lives, but if you're not convinced by that, look at the numbers, and we should not have these kinds of outbreaks in this world with the tech we have. This shouldn't be happening. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
So is it a great question here, and I have several on sort of preventatives. The gentleman, the doctor who introduced us, wanted to know the research that's happened on SARS-CoV-1, so the SARS from 2003, which some people now call classic SARS. I find that name pretty funny.
That's super troll, yeah.
But for classic SARS, how much has the work on that helped us here? Like, is there any practical place where what we did or what we learned about SARS-CoV-1 is helping us, or did we just do nothing and so we didn't get anywhere?
No, I wouldn't say we did nothing. I think quite a bit was done, and I'll tell you in a moment, but not enough, obviously, to prevent this. We weren't in a good position. But I think that outbreak made it clear that there were bad viruses that pose a threat to us, particularly in that part of the world. But we knew previously from Africa that bats harboring Ebola-like viruses were a problem. But those viruses typically remain confined to Africa, which is not to say it's good, but there was less global concern. But after the SARS outbreak, which went to 29 countries, there was a movement to say, let's find out what is in bats. And so a number of studies were done going to caves in the area, sampling bat guano. As I said, they found a number of bat SARS-like viruses. They were brought into labs, studied, and we realized that, first we could figure out what happened with the original SARS. One, we could reconstruct the series of events that we think happened leading to its emergence. And now we understand fully what's happening here. We're not totally in the dark. We know this most likely came from a bat in much the same way. And we also know from that work that there are SARS-like viruses in bats that pose a threat to people because they can infect human cells. So that's a very good thing. In the meanwhile, of course, we've had the MERS coronavirus emerge in the Middle East, further emphasizing that we need to be prepared for additional emergences. And between those two, there have been a number of antivirals that have been developed and tested. For MERS, we actually have a vaccine for camels to immunize them because that's how people get the disease there. And there are not enough human cases to justify immunizing all people in the area. But if we immunize the camels, that'll prevent the infection. And that's called the One Health approach, where everything is interconnected, right? All the animals on the planet are interconnected. So you protect the camels.
That blows my mind that we have a camel. Thank you for that fact. That will be my trivia fact for the week with my team when I go back to work later this afternoon. I learned today that we made, after MERS, we created a camel vaccine.
There's also one for a virus in Australia called Hendra, which is a bat virus that occasionally infects horses and their trainers. There have been a number of serious outbreaks in Australia, and they made a vaccine for the horses, again, to protect both them and the handlers because it's a very rare disease in people. So a One Health vaccine. And there will be other examples of this as well. So that approach really stimulated by the understanding that viruses in animal reservoirs are a threat to us. And then some other vaccine candidates have been developed. So there has absolutely been progress. Many people have studied these viruses in the laboratory. We've learned a lot about how they reproduce in cells, how they interact with immune defenses. And there's been a whole body of really interesting work that we've talked about many times over the years in our podcast. But unfortunately, none of that made us ready to stop this. We could understand it more quickly, and we have the tech to identify it really fast, but we're not ready to stop it. But I think we could have been.
Well, that's unfortunate. We always seem to learn too much. We learn the hard way. And a lot of what I try and do on Twitch is get people to be more forward, like learn from someone else, not learn from the school of hard knocks. But thank you for that. Devin, are you ready? with another one of your questions? I'm running thin on questions I had prepared, so I'll give the mic to you here for a little bit if you're ready, or I have a fun one, a little bit lighthearted.
Well, now you got to tell that one. That one's
well. All right, so you get ready. I will do the lighthearted one, and you get ready. One of the people who wrote in to me earlier wanted to know, on a scale from nothing to worry about at one end to the return of the Black Plague, how bad is this? So how in the history of epidemics or of great diseases of the world, it's obviously early to judge, but where would you put COVID-19?
So I'm going to talk about just in a say a medical view, not an economic view.
Yeah, medical.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I think it's hard to compare across many hundreds of years.
Of
right?
course.
So Black Plague would be a 10 in the scale of badness, right? And then there's 0, no worry. So let's see. I would put the 1918 influenza, 8 or 9.
Ooh, damn.
Those are pretty bad. It was 700,000 deaths in the U.S. But I would argue that was we didn't even know there were influenza viruses at that time. We barely had medicine. Medicine was a brand new young field, just developing. So I think that was a special case. I would put this virus it's really early. Okay,
I agree.
I think that we don't know actually how many people are infected, and that's why I think the fatality is could be much lower than we actually think it is. Of course, because it's a new virus, it's infecting many people. So even if the fatality is low, you're still, as a consequence of infecting many people, going to have a lot of deaths. And so I have seen 2009 H1N1, which killed 12,000 people in the U.S. And I had a guest last week on my podcast, and they said that was a disappointment to many people, which is a funny thing to say about a pandemic, right? It wasn't as bad as they thought it would be. I would be happy about that. So I would put that less than 5, probably, maybe a 3 or a 4. And then I also remember so we've had the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2015, which had many deaths. And so I think that, because it was very hard to control it, took a lot of lives, I would put that, but it didn't have global spread potential. Maybe I'd put that at a 6 or so. And then there's the 1968 influenza pandemic, which killed about 120,000 people in the U.S., quite an extensive pandemic. And probably that's a 6 also. So this is a tough one. I hope these words don't come back to haunt me in the future, but I would put this at a 4 or 5, right? I don't think this is in terms of medicine, I think in the end, this will be milder than we think, and is only limited by our capacity to take care of patients. So I think the virus itself is not going to turn out to be as lethal as we think it is. So that's where I would put this.
And totally understand that I put you on the spot with an unanswerable question.
It's okay. It's fun. It's fun
good.
to do.
I'm glad.
But, that was my thought process, right?
God, I so wish I could. I'll have to do it online, because I know you share your virology class online, but we need more professors like you who can make education fun in that way. So.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical to our future. Is that I'm personally in the camp that my most terrifying thing I've ever heard is that the new studies that came out that the number one most desired job in America is YouTuber. We need to I am just it's we need more people like you in humanity to inspire people to be scientists and be people that are looking at things that are actually important rather than creating content like my dumbass, right? Yeah. So please continue to do what you do, and you do explain it in a way that is so clear, and I think some people, you don't. I know all the crazy research stuff, but you speak in a way that everybody can relate to.
Yeah, there was only one
time.
I appreciate that. There was only one time in this whole 2 hours where you went when you were talking about mRNA vaccines and lipids, and I was struggling to stay with you, and that was the only one time in a 2-hour talk. And that's
Ethan struggles. It's challenging because that dude's very smart.
Yeah, I mean, I I was with you, but I'm like, okay, lipids are fats. Like I'm doing this mental translation in my head of
Yeah, I knew
what's
that
going
was a
on.
little. I knew that
No.
was a little hard, but basically the mRNA is protected. So if you put RNA into cells, it's very unstable. It'll fall apart. So they designed these little protectors basically to protect the RNA, and it's made of fat, little balls of fat, you could say, that
That's
coat
pretty
the
crazy.
RNA, and it goes in the cell and does its thing. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
I don't know where the ability to do that comes from. I've always liked teaching people. And I think it helps that I have 40 years of experience working with viruses of all sorts. So I can draw
That
from
helps
that.
a little, yeah.
It helps.
Yeah.
But
Could be a contributing factor.
I think, a number of, as I said earlier, a number of people have said they want to be a virologist now because of all this. And some people are influenced by our podcasts and by the videos and so forth. That's the best thing that I can do is inspire someone
Yes.
to be a virologist. I really enjoy teaching people. I love when people say, wow, I didn't, like you guys say multiple times, wow, I didn't know that.
Mhm.
I think that's great to impart knowledge. In fact, in my class here at Columbia, once a student said, every lecture I could go home and tell my roommate something that was wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Mhm.
so true. And for everyone watching, uh, Vincent's classes, he puts his classes on YouTube. So if you want to know a
That's
lot
awesome.
more about virology, it's all up on YouTube. It's on his podcast. We've linked in chat many times to his website. So I do have a couple more questions, but Devin, you're up. I turned it to you.
Sure. One of the things that I think that a lot of people are wondering is how can regular people actually contribute to this? Can they do anything? And there's some people that are installing. This is beyond my expertise, right? Like virus fabricators, like the Virus Fabricator 3000 on their system, or is the software that crunches some numbers or something. I don't know. There's other people that are wondering what they can do in their communities. There's some really cool small businesses that are like producing hospital stuff. Like, what can people do?
Well, one of the things that's come up in the last week, if you have sewing skills, is that people are starting to sew face masks, right?
Mhm.
CDC has instructions, and my local hospital sent instructions out as well. I know not everybody sews, but even if it's just for you and your family, because you can't buy a face mask, they can be effective. And if you make it out of cloth, the right cloth, you can wash it and clean it up. So I think that's something you can do. I think you can also engage people. A lot of people are sitting at home and they kind of feel isolated, uh, and you can engage them. I've had lots of conversations online with people who have questions. I'm happy to answer them, and I think they feel good afterwards. They say thank you. It's really great to be able to talk to a scientist and get the real facts. People are so upset that they watch the news and they feel they're not getting the truth, whatever that may be.
Or worse, it's just outright fucking terrifying.
Yeah, I mean,
I watch the
well,
news and like we're all gonna die. Like it's they just it seems like they have a some kind of skill to bring on experts that
yeah.
are all just saying, like we're screwed,
Well, that's
just,
how they make a
yeah,
living, right?
yeah.
The
Hmm.
problem is it's kind of um, it's a paradox because the news companies have to make a living, and they do that by scaring people to get them to watch, right?
Hmm.
When I grew up, it was just TV, and we used to watch Walter Cronkite on Channel 2, and that was our news, and we believed everything he said, right? That was the gospel, and he never would intentionally try and excite you. When he described the moon landing, he was so calm, right? And now that's all out the door. And that's the
Yeah.
problem with news as I see it. So if you can calm people down, if you can talk to them online, I think that really helps a lot. And now in your community, it's hard to do these things outside because you're not supposed to be interacting with people. But we've got a couple of emails from mail delivery people who are scared, and maybe you put a bottle of Purell in your mailbox so they can clean themselves after they deliver their mail because they're very concerned. All these people who are doing the public good. So I think anything that you can do to help be nice to people, and we have to do it online, especially now, would really help because humanity is what saves us in the end. Being nice to each other. I got to tell you, when people thank me, it's really great, and I'm sure you feel the same way. So if you anything you do, just have that as a goal in mind.
as a little bit of an addition to that, just to add in, since I haven't been doing this in these shows, but I feel very strongly about this. Add in something, guys. Be so careful with the information sources that you get your information from. We live in a world right now where information is everywhere. Anybody's blog, anybody's YouTube channel, like in whatever the, www.dangerousviruses.net or .tv or something, right? Like Ethan is doing it, and I guess myself, I don't by extension, is doing a service. Dr. Vincent Racaniello coming on here and doing this is a service to humanity. Seriously, to give this information correct, and actually, Doctor, maybe that's a really good follow-up question: is what sources can people trust in this time of such unbelievable misinformation?
Well, I have always said that you should go to WHO website, who.org or .int. I don't remember. They have really good information. They're summarizing this outbreak on a daily basis. That's really good. And I love promedmail.org. All right. This is a little known source, an aggregator of international health information.
What's that site?
Yeah,
ProMedMail, PROMEDMAIL.org.
All right.
And
excellent. Yeah. This
is wonderful. You can have them email you a daily summary of what's going on. And they cover all infectious diseases, not just SARS-CoV-2 now, but everything else. And I have a daily list of different infections that are going on in the world. It's really good stuff. And of course, in the US, even though the CDC, I think, has blundered multiple times, I think that they're overall a good organization with very good people. A lot of people I know working there. CDC.gov is a great site for information of all kinds about the outbreak. And of course, you should always listen to This Week in Virology, because we're a bunch of scientists talking about this. And the last thing we would want to do is mislead you. We get lots of questions. We try and answer them. We're going to 3 times a week now to try and get everybody's questions in. And if you listen to us, you'll find lots of good links of places to go to and get good information. So I would highly recommend that. And also, someone asked me in the past week, why don't you put your podcast on YouTube as just an audio? So I've been doing that, and many people apparently like to listen on YouTube. So that's another place you can go to consume it.
Absolutely excellent. Thank you so much for being so passionate about this subject and wanting to get the right information out there. I mean, I literally mean, I think you are doing such a great service to people, especially in a time where we have such a lack of information about this subject and just crazy misinformation going around.
So can I just say one thing?
Absolutely.
Please.
I want to tell you what my dream is, right? So here I'm in my 60s. I don't know how many more years I have left, maybe a lot. And I really like teaching people. I really like making podcasts and videos. And one of the people, and everyone listening probably knows Marcus Brownlee, right? Who has this wonderful studio, and he reviews tech stuff in a great way. And he has his own studio here in the New York area. And that's my goal, to have a science studio one day where I go in and make science videos, not maybe just virology, maybe other things, but I go in and I have a little group of people and we say, this is what we're going to do today. And we put out the coolest science videos. I would so love to be able to do that. So that's one of my goals, to try and raise enough money to do that and make it sustaining in some way, because I really enjoy beyond the lab. That's what I'd like to do. So just a little bit of dreaming. I do that too.
Well,
I love it.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And if there's for what it's worth, my other hat that I wear is an agency that brings people in via digital media. If I could ever be of service to you, and I mean, not even in a professional, like I will just help you, because I think you're doing the right thing.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah. Please hit me up, because that's literally what I do. Is I bring businesses into the digital age. So if I can help, let me know.
Yeah, and as both of us have shared with you, you're a natural here because you're already used to podcasting and already comfortable. I think you could do a great job.
My guy comes in with like a professional mic, a virus throw pillow in the back. Like you get good sound quality. You're set up, man. Like,
yeah, you're really good at it. Talking about misinformation a little bit, there's been some questions about ibuprofen and its impact or interaction. Can you say a little bit about that?
So there was a report, I believe, in Lancet just in the past week or so. Um, I think a physician had seen a few patients, COVID-19 patients, who had received ibuprofen, and they seemed to do a little worse than other patients. And so the letter that he wrote to the Lancet speculated that this may be because ibuprofen is is doing something to enhance virus replication. Now, it was completely speculative, and it was based on a very small number of patients. But of course, this in this era where everyone is scared, this news spread rapidly. And my clinician colleague Daniel Griffin, who was on TWIV this past Friday, said all of a sudden his phone was ringing left and right. Thousands of doctors calling him. Should we no longer prescribe ibuprofen to COVID-19 patients? And so he said, well, the data are slim, but let's just prescribe something else. Let's give some, is it over the counters, of course. Let's give something else, not a ibuprofen, but there are other substitutes. And so that's what they're doing, just to be cautious. So his advice is don't use ibuprofen for the moment. You can use Tylenol or something else and get around the problem.
Yeah. Okay. So there's no strong evidence that ibuprofen has any impact on COVID-19. It was one doctor's observations. Right. So maybe, but not even the level of study that you referred to with chloroquine earlier, where we've had small studies. This was just literally a doctor looking at his patients and saying, this is what I seem to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if it's a big issue, we'll see. We're going to see some reports in the coming weeks. But just to be cautious, Daniel Griffin says we won't use it. And I think that's a reasonable action to take at this point.
Mm-hmm. Sure, because we have tons of alternatives for that.
That's right.
So related to this, what are the best things you can do to take care of yourself if you do think you have a mild form of this? Because testing isn't necessarily available. But I guess... could you say a little about if you think you're sick, or what are there anything? I'm babbling this question. I'm sorry. What do you do for yourself before you determine you need to go to the hospital? Because most people apparently don't need hospitalization.
Right. So I asked this of Daniel Griffin. By the way, Daniel Griffin is the head of a very large healthcare network here in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area with millions, 1.5 million patients and 3,000 physicians. And he's the chief of infectious diseases. So he's very busy, not getting much sleep.
And he's on your podcast, right? You two share podcasts.
Yeah, so he's on one of my others, but now he's going to be coming regularly onto the Virology TWIV to give us an update on the clinical situation. So I asked him that question. He said the first thing you should do if you have like flu-like symptoms, right, which many viruses can cause, especially in the winter, he said, call your physician. Physicians now have been told we have a new way of dealing with illness. The patients are not going to come to your office. You're going to have to speak to them on the phone and try and figure out what's going on. So call your physician, tell them your symptoms. The physician will say, you sound like you're okay. Stay home. Don't go out. And if your if your symptoms worsen, give me a call. So if you're not having trouble breathing, there's no need for you to go to the hospital. And if and again, they won't test you, so you don't know if you have influenza or something else. So if you do feel like you have a respiratory infection, you should stay home until it resolves. If the conditions get worse, if you can't breathe, definitely call the physician. They will have you brought to the hospital. So that's the best thing that you can do, because you don't want to go to doctors' offices and potentially infect other people.
Okay. Devin.
Along those lines, that follow up, is there anything a person can do? Is it just basically get lots of rest and drink water if they feel sick? Well,
if you feel sick, you can take things to alleviate your fever, right? You can take non-ibuprofen medications to do that. You should always hydrate yourself, but you should also make sure you have electrolytes. And one of the things that may accompany COVID-19 is diarrhea, gastroenteritis, right? Which seems to be happening in a number of people. Daniel Griffin said a number of his patients start with diarrhea, start with gastroenteritis, and then progress to the respiratory disease. Of course, if you have diarrhea, you're losing fluids, you need to replace them with electrolytes. So you have to make sure that you're doing that. But basically, stay home and get rest, because resting is the best way for you to recover. Don't go out, of course, and spread the infection. And I think that's the best that you could do, unless you're having trouble breathing, of course.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there anything that would make it worse? There's rumors that going out and exercising, things that would work your lungs hard, would be bad. Obviously, we know probably smoking isn't good, but you listed some great things to do. Is there a list, if you think you're sick or might have this, do we know anything about what to avoid to try and minimize, besides other people, what to avoid?
Right. I think exercising might not be a good idea, especially if you're going to be breathing heavily. It may help to redistribute virus in the lung, right? And you probably want to avoid that. But I don't think you should smoke. Certainly, you shouldn't consume alcohol, at least not gin and tonics, at least in large quantities, because that'll influence your immune responses. I think basically there's not a lot on the list aside. If you're staying home, no smoking, no alcohol consumption, try and avoid other people. And it is not something that lasts months. It's a few week illness. It's kind of like influenza. You may feel lousy for a while, but eventually you'll recover.
And lots of people, and I know Devin has been worried about this before, there's this persistent belief about lung scarring or fibrosis,
long-term damage.
Damage. And I think, though you talked about it when you were here 2 weeks ago, it's a largely different audience. What would you say about what it's early, but what do we know about that?
So I asked Daniel Griffin that, and he says first of all, we don't know anything about long-term, because
there is no long-term.
It's just a few months into this outbreak, but he does see lung damage. So, you release patients, you take an x-ray and you see, the lesions are better, but they're still there. And so he feels there is some short-term damage that doesn't go away. And whether that heals in months, we don't know. It remains to be seen. Certainly there is the potential, right? Because you're damaging the lowest parts of the lungs. And in some people, it just doesn't repair properly. So there is the potential for long-term damage, but that's not something we can really predict at this point. We'll just have to see.
All right. Great. Devin, anything else you'd love to cover?
I'm good and have to hop off soon. I think we are in a really good place right now.
Yeah, well, we've had a tremendous amount of new good information. For a lot of people, I think, just arrived on stream. We've gone for 2 hours. This will be posted, I'm sure, on Devin's YouTube as well as my own.
Yes.
Later today, at least in our case, we'll get it up quickly.
That's fast. We can't do that. I can't do that as fast. That's good. Yeah.
Well, we won't edit as heavily, so you'll get the whole unfiltered view of the last 2 hours with Dr. Vincent Racaniello. Once again, he's a professor of immunology and microbiology. I think I'm reversing those if you want them in a certain order. Microbiology and immunology at Columbia University Medical Center in New York City. He's been generous with his time here again, spent 2 hours with us. I think he's also indicated a willingness to come back later and talk to us again about the progress of the epidemic. So if you're interested in that, please follow either me or Devin. And we'll make sure to get the word out when he comes back with more to share. I do think if I could summarize on the stream, we have caution. I'll let Dr. Racaniello have the last word. I think we have cautious reason for optimism. The early numbers now from Italy show that the extreme measures taken there do seem to be capping the growth rate. Based on some other coronaviruses, there is reason to hope, unproven, that summer warmth in the northern hemisphere will decrease the spread. There's reason to hope, again unproven, that some existing medications will prove at least partially effective. And so I've given several reasons to hope. None of them is an absolute, but I think we had several positive signs. Is there anything you'd add to that, Vincent?
I think that's all great. I agree with you. And I think I am very positive that we are going to get through this in a reasonable amount of time, as long as people stay home for now. I know it's tough. You'll be able to do it. And don't panic. I know a lot of people are getting scared. Don't. There's no reason to be. This is not a world kill. I think Devin asked me last time, are we all going to die?
I did say that. Yes, that's something that I would say.
And I said, absolutely not. You will be able to do what you did before at some point. And I know this. I have complete faith in the medical establishment, the science establishment, the healthcare establishment of this country that we'll get through this. And so I want you to share my faith in that. Usually I don't talk about faith in science, but I know it can be done. And the things I see, I mean, the amazing vaccine progress is very cool. We're going to have some antivirals, I think, in a short period of time. And I think we'll be ready for the next one. So I just have no panic, just be positive and listen to This Week in Virology for more. If you really want to hear more about this sort of thing, we do it multiple times a week.
I will put your link everywhere in my media.
Yeah, we've done the same. And I'm sure we all very much, we expressed our appreciation earlier, but we completely appreciate your participation here and all you've shared, bringing in the information from so many experts. We'll bid you good day. I'm going to spend a few minutes on with my chat here, just taking questions. I'll turn on our Q&A extension, and then we'll all go visit Devin Nash later on, who has a show coming that'll be more traditional Twitch. Who is your guest later today, Devin?
Oh, Moist Critical. He's a person that I've admired for a really long time. He's a broadcaster and also a YouTuber, and he makes very unique and creative content. So I'm really looking forward to talking to him.
All right. So we'll see you there in a bit. Vincent, thank you so much. I'll reach out to you again in email about when it might make sense for you to return, when we'll fit your... I congratulate you, by the way. You've been all over sharing information on CNN and elsewhere. So please keep it up for the good of the people.
I will.
Yeah,
well,
you are doing an amazing service, man.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me again. And I really look forward to coming back. I'll be happy to do it anytime.
Great.
Right.
I mean, we'll take you up on that. And also, if there's ever anything I can help to get your message out there, please hit me up.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Goodbye. See you soon, Devin.
Yeah.
All right. You got it.
Bye.
Bye.
So let me get Zoom out of here. So everybody, that was fantastic. Dr. Racaniello is amazing. I'll switch views here. This is me normally. And it's been so great to have him here. I'll take just a minute. I have to run the controls and re-enable our Q&A functionality in our extension. That will take me just a second to do. And then we can talk here, and I'll also say a little for those of you who are new about what it is I do on my stream. What I normally do is I am vice president of Twitch Prime at Amazon. When I speak here, I don't represent either Amazon or Twitch. And instead, I speak on my own. My opinions here are my own. It was my privilege today, with Twitch's support, to host as a public service Dr. Racaniello trying to give us all information in this crazy time. But what I normally do, and the Q&A extension is now up, if those of you familiar with it want to ask questions. I have to go back to work at Amazon here in a little while, but I can take a few top voted questions about the stream or about what I know, which is basically leading in a situation like this. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about leadership and career in this circumstance. So if you are interested in that, that's my normal fare. My goal is to basically help you speed run your career. So I explain it in gamer terms. Twitch is obviously very gamer friendly. and my goal is to take my experience, share it with you so that you can be more successful in your career faster than I have been. So I've had a lot of good luck in my career. I've made it a long way, but my passion is helping others do the same. And we have an active Discord where we coach each other, we review resumes, we prep people for interviews, etc. No question. So this didn't activate. Wonder why that is. My staff letting me know. Hang on. That should have worked. So let me see here. We may not be able to, we should be able to activate an extension. You may have to refresh is my guess. Yeah. So for anybody who wants to ask viewer questions, if you refresh, you'll then see an icon in the middle right of your screen that you can use to ask questions. Yes, and with this many viewers, you can quickly overload it. That's okay. My team will start approving questions. They're all moderated, and then you can vote on them, and I'll take top voted questions here in a minute. In any case, so in the gamer analogy, though, look, career and gaming actually have a lot in common. They're both strategy games. They're like RPGs. And your resume is your character sheet, what you learn in high school, in college, and on the job. Those are your skill trees, and you level up in different things. You get promoted. That's specifically how you level up. And that's what we normally talk about. And what I normally do here is help people be effective in their careers. And so it's been my privilege to do a lot of that on Twitch. And we're going into tough times. I don't think there's anybody worldwide who believes that we don't have a recession already in progress, and that recession, at least temporarily, will be deepened by the impact of the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've talked some about how to prepare for that. I've also talked a little bit about how we, as leaders, and everyone is a leader in some context, how we lead in these circumstances. And to lead effectively, this is really unprecedented because there is no playbook. I've been a leader 25 years. I've led teams up to 800 in global situations. I've had offices in Bangalore, India, in Beijing, China, as well as up and down the U.S. West Coast. I've led in startups as well as at Amazon. And though these are my opinions, there's really no playbook for global pandemic coupled with global economic disruption. There's no place where normally when I have a leadership problem or challenge, if I have a personnel problem, I go to an HR expert or a book. If I have an economic problem, I go to a finance expert or to a class and an MBA on finance. But there's no manage being under a stay home order for weeks at a time. So I've thought a lot about that. The closest analogy I found by doing some quick research comes from the military. And it's the idea that a situation like this is called VUCA, V-U-C-A. It's volatile, uncertain. Now I'm going to struggle to get the. It's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And so we're in times that are highly volatile, where things change very quickly. They're uncertain. We don't know what's going to come next. They're complex. And so there's many different factors, and that's the supply chain disruption, economic disruption, people out of jobs, movement disruption, fear, and of course, disease, all coupled together, incredibly complex. And then it's ambiguous. Even the real state of truth is not known. How many people are sick? When will the supply chain resume, and in what way? What are we going to have shortages of? What are we not? And I think we're all learning this as we go. In other words, it would be normal to learn from the past or from previous examples, but there's very little to work with here. So with that, this is the kind of stuff I do. And if you like that, please follow the channel and come back. We will have Dr. Racaniello back on. We also, through a Twitch employee, Think Banhammer in chat, if he's here, who is Dr. Brian Weller, we have access to a set of world-class economists and financial experts. And so we'll do future streams where we investigate more the financial impact of this disruption. And so we'll have Dr. Weller back on. He is director of data science at Twitch, but we'll also have some of his network connections who really can help us understand what we know about the financial impact. With that said, some of you have put in some good questions and voted on them. So let me take a couple of those just in the limited time I have. And the first question is, how has COVID and the work from home situation affected the ability to lead your organization? So I love to talk about that. And that's why I'm gonna do a happy hour with my stream team for my next show. One of the things we've learned is that getting people together just socially is obviously very important. Human beings are social animals, and yet we're asking all of us to be in isolation. And so we're going to do a happy hour for my stream team, but I also do that kind of thing for my workplace teams. And that's because social care is much deeper. So I will admit, I'm normally, I'm an engineer by trade, and I'm normally not that emotional or outwardly inquisitive about how other people are feeling. But it's been really important with my team not only to talk about them about their work, but to check in, how are they doing personally? How are they faring? What pressures are they under? And we have made adjustments. Harstar, I see you in chat, one of our channel, longtime channel followers asking, how do you convey this message to your CEO? I think one way would be a clip. But I would just, I'll tell you what I did is with some leaders internal to our company, I simply emailed them and said, look, we need to hear from you. And I didn't criticize. I just said, the employee populace is concerned. We're isolated. We have fears about what's going to happen, whether it's economically or to our kids or to our parents or our relatives, what's happening to our friends. Many people are already unemployed temporarily or long-term from restaurants, bars, travel, hotels, many industries. We have a lot of worries. You need to deal with that. So the bottom line answering this, how can I lead? I am an in-person leader. I like to sit with people. I like to gather them around. I particularly like to bond with people over shared meals. And that's not possible right now. One of my favorite ways to bond with my team is to eat with them because I believe, and I've talked about this before, that eating together is a natural human family act, that it's hard, it's really hard, it's rare to sit down with someone to a meal and not gain some closer sense of attachment to them. If you think about how often, other than perhaps your family Thanksgiving, you've hated someone that you've eaten dinner with, is very rare. I guess it happens, but it's not normal. And I see in chat you say, could you video chat brunch and lunch? Yeah. So managers on my team have done that. I run a pretty big team right now, but there's one manager on my team who does a breakfast coffee. Like they all get together for coffee in the morning and they just share coffee and shoot the breeze for a little while they drink a cup of coffee. There's another manager on my team who's coming in every day and starting up a stream, a video chat for lunch, and whoever wants to can show up. They bring their lunch and they just sit and they don't talk work during that time. And so they just eat their lunch together. Some people, I see the joke in chat about coffee in Seattle, probably eat their coffee. I happen to like chocolate-coated espresso beans, so I can eat my coffee. But they eat together, and that's their way of hanging out. So I don't drink my coffee. I chew my beans. Yeah, there you go. All right. So I would say, though, COVID-19 and the related stay-at-home directives have thrown classic leadership up in the air in different ways. We found that the informal communication network is gone. So the bump into somebody in the hallway or in the elevator is gone. So teams inside themselves, in a small team, they set up a call and they communicate very well. But in a large setting, they lose that communication. That's what we've seen. So I'm going to go on to the next. So you have to foster that. You have to set up something to cause cross-team communication to resume. I'll go to the next question, which is here in our system. I was laid off due to the economic effects of coronavirus. What's the best way to reach out to employers during a pandemic? I'm a software engineer. So, great question. There's a ton of pieces to this answer. And first, I'm sorry for you, for anyone laid off as a side effect of this. I think that's going to be common. And I have done a couple of whole shows you can find in my Twitch archives on getting prepared for bad times. They're on how to get your resume in shape, how to get your LinkedIn in shape, to network. So the first thing I would say is make a good resume. And we've done a bunch of streams on this. The second thing I'd say is use your network. So if you're already a software engineer or whatever your job is, you want to reach out to people that already know you or that have some connection to you, whether it's through your school, whether it's through your business connections, past associates, family, whatever, and get a real introduction to a live human. So the most effective way always to reach out to employers is through a person or a relationship, not a cold call. That said, being hired is all about value. It's all about showing the employer that you are the solution to their problem, whatever it is. And so they post a job. That job doesn't just represent a paycheck. It represents a problem and an opportunity. And so reach out to that. Try and tailor what you're going to do. When you apply somewhere, you don't want to talk about what you want, particularly in a recession. There are times where you can talk about the salary you want, and the office you want, and the car the company car you want. But normally, you talk instead about what you can solve for the company. So the most effective approach is to say, look, I'm a software engineer with this, that, and the other experience. I love to solve problems, and I've heard you have a problem with this, or I see you're in this industry, and this is how I'd like to contribute. That is the best way to approach an employer. You need to be a solution to a problem they're willing to pay to solve. You're just a human intermediary for that. So, all right. And we'll talk about this all the time. If you want to follow, I'm sure over the next few weeks, I'll be talking, and unfortunately, maybe few months, a common theme on my show will be how to get a job when you're unemployed due to the economic downturn. I hope that isn't true, but I think that's going to be common. Yeah, and people in all kinds of fields solve problems. I see a chat. It's obviously not only engineers. So the next question here, can you give us an update on how your team is handling work from home? I'm a new teacher hire, and I've seen my colleagues have trouble adapting to these technologies that are new to them. Has it been the same for your team? We've had some expected problems, technology problems, and we've had some unexpected problems. And by the way, the people in chat, I think most of you are joking, but if you think unemployment's going to save you, I would not count on that. Sure, you can get a small unemployment check for a while, but it's going to be bad. I'm guessing most people here in chat, your lifestyle and the amount of money from unemployment are not well correlated, is the gentlest thing I can say about that. So I strongly advise you try something else. In any case, this update on work from home, the first problem we saw was technology that didn't work. So we saw video chat wasn't working for them. Their home network wasn't up to it. We didn't have a shared whiteboard solution that was approved by our security team. So we had to solve technology problems. The second round of problems moved to workspace problems. I don't have a desk. I don't have a good chair. My back hurts. I don't have a keyboard. So we sent people back into the office to go grab their office equipment and bring it home if they wanted to. Now, I had my streaming set up. So when I'm done here and I need to go back to Amazon here in a few minutes, I'll just literally pick up my work laptop, plug it into the same thing, and go right back to work. But most people didn't have that. And so they had to set up an office space. Then in Seattle, the schools closed, and they had to deal with their kids being home suddenly and having kids in their workspace or trying to work with family worries and distractions. And I think these lists of problems are going to just continue because really we've only been 2 weeks. The social isolation hasn't really set in as strongly as it will, particularly because more and more jurisdictions are imposing very strong travel bans. I saw go by in chat while we were still on with Vincent. I saw it go by in chat how we had India has apparently issued a 21-day lockdown or ban or something. I haven't had a chance. I may use the wrong word, but India has just closed down in some way. And so that's 1 billion people, right? If it's a whole country ban, which is what I saw scroll by in chat, if it's true, 21-day lockdown. Yeah, that's incredible, right? It's and some people in chat are saying it's not that long or not that deep. And Azo Dio, you asked earlier about the economic consequences. I want to cover that question. So I'll take it next before we go on through the widget because it's one I want to cover. But to finish answering this, I think the best thing this new teacher and some colleagues can do is realize we're going to be in novel problem-solving mode for a while. So we have novel coronavirus, but we have novel coronavirus problems too. For example, I went through with my team just recently, hey, who is your backup who's going to cover for you if you get sick and you have to take a week off because you do have this illness? So who's going to step up? Who should I go to? Who should I view as being in charge of your team? And I've told them who will take over my team as well. And that's just planning in advance. But my point is you can anticipate some of these problems, and more, you can anticipate that new problems are coming. In Europe, for example, I know that streaming services, some streaming services like Netflix, and I think also, although I don't speak for them, Amazon Prime Video, have had to cut their bandwidth to preserve more bandwidth for business and homeschooling. So these are problems everyone has to work through. And so I think this is going to be a big issue. Bottom line is you can anticipate things coming. So before I go to the next question in the widget, I was asked during the last chat, where we had Devin and Vincent on, I was asked, can we estimate the economic impact of this, all these shutdowns? And the first answer to that is no. Like, it's well beyond me. But what I want to teach you real quick is making a so-called back of the envelope estimate to give you a sense of the order of magnitude is possible. And Hexadroid, the mods will explain that to you. And you should all get good at this if you can, because it will help you lead a team or be good at your business. So how much economic damage is going to come from COVID-19? I am not an economist. I never have had a finance class, but I can do basic math. And so And it turns out, just like staying at a Holiday Inn Express, that qualifies me to make an estimate in broad terms to get an approximation. Is it going to be millions of damage, hundreds of millions, billions, trillions, more? Yeah, and I see what you want to talk about, Azo. I'll cover that maybe as well. But first, you need an estimate of the cost. To answer that question, you need an estimate of the economic impact. So the first baseline we can use is the U.S. is talking about a multi-trillion-dollar stimulus package. The UK has also already done a stimulus package on the same order of magnitude. So between just two major countries, large countries with big economies, you have several trillion dollars just in stimulus. Then you ripple out from that and you say, okay, there's a lot more countries and their governments are going to spend and invest. And so you easily get to 10 trillion just in government spending to try and prop up economies. I see, by the way, some people are trying to put links in chat. We have links shut down for such a large chat, but you can DM them to one of our moderators. There's several moderators, and they can put them on if we need them. I see you were trying to share something valuable about the India lockdown. You can also share that in Discord, where I'm super interested in it, if you join our Discord. Because I'm going to immediately get off here, go back to work, but then tonight I'm going to want to read about what's been done in India. Going back to this question, though, then you have to look at all the damage that government stimulus doesn't begin to touch. Supply chain, unemployment, lost productivity, lost wages. Snordizzle, I can go update, but we're already done with Dr. Racaniello, so we're just wrapping up here because I am not the expert. We did that already. Basically, I think you can take the tens of trillions and you may quickly get to 100 trillion. But the point is, we know it's at least tens of trillions and that it's a lot bigger. And so then the question that's been asked is how do we compare that to the cost of the economic damage? And one way to go look at that is you can go look at the budget. Dr. Racaniello, who was on, talked about the entire NIH budget, so the U.S. National Institute of Health. And I haven't done this, but I'm going to do it right now because why not? I think we can just Google quickly their research budget, and that's for all diseases. So NIH research budget 2020. Here we go. So the Senate bill was going to be given $3 billion to the NIH, and that's for all diseases, as an example. And it said the agency's total budget would then be $42 billion. Now, that's for all diseases of all kinds worldwide. A tiny percentage of that goes to viruses and to pandemics in the hundreds of millions, is my belief, my working from memory. The point is, though, if you have an economic event that's, let's call it for a minute, 40 trillion, and their budget is 40 billion, then you're at 1/10 of 1%, and that's for all diseases. So the question of what it would have cost to try and work on pandemic or virus control is a fraction of that 40 billion. Bottom line is we can buy cheap insurance. And in the future, I'm sure the governments of the world, Dr. Racaniello and people like him, are going to become incredibly well-funded, I think. The real tragedy there is probably our next national or global disaster will not be a virus. And so what's sad is we won't necessarily apply that to other causes. You could say there's an issue. I want to be careful not to become political. But there are a number of other issues that are also planet-wide risks that we may not apply the lesson of, holy crap, prevention is cheaper than treatment to those other problems. And so whether you look at that as environmental, social inequality, etc., I think the real question is not will we learn the lesson about viruses specifically, because we will, but will we learn the lesson about other things?